Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Jonathan and Sophia, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. Lonely Isolation. Jonathan Rusher wished everyone would just leave him alone. Much as he loved his family, they tended to fuss over him too much, and he often felt quite stifled. At first, it had just been his 6 brothers who always wanted to know what he was doing or where he was doing or where he was at all times. Those he'd managed to handle by disappearing into the forest whenever he felt they were becoming a nuisance. Since they were almost always busy on the farm with their various duties, they rarely took offense when he slipped away. But then, his 3 older brothers Jedediah, Joshua, and John got married, and their wives also took upon themselves the roles of unwanted guardians over him. These were more persistent, and since he liked them all, a lot actually, he tried his best to accommodate their fussing. Still, he wished they wouldn't worry so much about him because it made him feel guilty when he had to hide from them. He was a full-grown man, for crying out loud, but everyone behaved as if he was 12 years old and might get lost in the forest. He just had to turn around, and there was a rusher, either male or female underfoot, waiting to ask him if he was all right or if he needed anything. It was quite infuriating, and he wished they would just stay out of his way. On this particular afternoon, he was concentrating on mending some of his traps, and one was proving difficult, causing him to mutter to himself in irritation. The scowl on his face deepened when he heard footfalls coming along the path to his house. Having taken the cabin that was furthest away, on the land, and quite close to the forest, he'd built a fence that kept out most animals, but once in a while, the cunning ones like foxes slipped through. They usually hovered around when he was drying out the pelts of the animals he'd caught, but he was careful to keep them high above the ground, away from their greedy paws. His enclosed compound had 2 gates, one at the front and the other at the back of the house. These footsteps were coming through the front, and that could only mean that it was one of his fussy relatives. Looking up, he found his youngest brother walking towards him. "You look like you want to hit me, dear brother." Jeremiah Rusher stood at a respectful distance, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Please don't harm the messenger. I'm just your little brother who bears a message of goodwill to you." "What do you want?" Jonah, much as he didn't like his name shortened, it was better than what his brothers had all called him before. They'd referred to him as the other Joan for so long until Abigail changed all that. "Abby hasn't seen you in 3 days, and you know how much she worries about you. Now she has Beth and Kate agitating to see you just so they can be sure that you're all right. Jed is convinced that something bad has happened to you, and therefore they all sent me to check up on you. Jed asked that you to come to the house, and he told me to use every means necessary to get you there." Jeremiah sighed. "But you're bigger and stronger than me, Jonah, and all I can do is to appeal to the kindness of your heart." Jonathan raised both hands in the air as he stood up and walked down the steps from his small porch. "As you can see," he slowly turned around, "I'm all right, in perfectly good health, and very busy, so none of you need worry about me. Not a single scratch on me. I was just mending some of my traps when you came up, and that's something I need to finish doing. I can see for myself that you're all right, but Abby will only settle down when she sees you with her own 2 eyes. At least that's what she told me. She also said to tell you that she's making apple cobbler and promised me an extra slice if I got you down to the house for dinner. And Beth is making chocolate ice cream, too. You know that John finally got that silly hand-cranked freezer to work, and our dear sister has been making all sorts of ice cream flavors since then. Jeremiah licked his lips in anticipation. Would you please come home? Jonathan sighed and then nodded. He might as well go and get it over with, or else he'd have his other brothers making the trek to his house. There was a reason he'd chosen the workers' cabin that was farthest from the main house, but nobody seemed to understand his need for isolation. It was when he'd started building the cabin that Jed got it into his mind to also provide quarters for their married employees. And because it was Jed who'd summoned him just now, he would obey. I have to check on some of my traps first and see if they caught anything. Are you hoping to find a peace offering for our sister Abby? You could say that, but sometimes I think you're too nosy for your own good, Jeremiah. Now, do you want to help me with the traps or not? If it will make you smile, then I'll help you. Besides that, you promised that you would one day show me your secret cave. While I don't remember making such a promise, there's a reason I keep that cave secret. It's so that when I feel that all of you are overcrowding me, I can disappear for days without any of you finding me. Are you implying that we're bothersome to you, Jonah? Don't be a smart mouth, little boy. That's not what I said. A man sometimes needs to go off on his own without having everyone worrying about him. Well, I don't want to argue with you because I'm in a very good mood today. Because of Abby's apple cobbler and Beth's chocolate ice cream. What a simpleton you are, little Jeremiah, Jonathan teased. Of course not, though those things are good too, and I'm looking forward to enjoying them. This was supposed to be a secret, but since you'll soon find out anyway, I might as well tell you. Kate and John have asked me to go to Chicago with them. They're going to check on a new engine Mr. Longer is building before he retires fully, and kindly offered to bring me along. Though Jeremiah was a few months shy of his 20th birthday, at that moment he looked like little Jacob, their little nephew, whenever he received a new toy from one of his many uncles. His eyes were sparkling with joy and excitement. Are you sure you didn't pester them to take you along, you pesky imp? Honestly, all I said was that I'd never been out of Woodland ever since we came here a few years ago, and our dear sister Kate said that it was big a shame. That's when she said I could go with them, and John had to agree. Of course, he had to agree seeing as he was left no choice otherwise. It's a man's duty to make his wife happy, and John is fast learning to do that. If Kate says you can go, then there's nothing else he can do but acquiesce. You need to understand that John and Kate are still on their honeymoon, and you would do well to leave them be. Who has a honeymoon for nearly a year? Jeremiah scoffed, pulling up a blade of grass and chewing on it. There's a lot of work on the farm, and lazing around claiming to be on honeymoon doesn't get it done. He kicked a small skull out of the path, probably that of a rabbit that had met its demise between the jaws of a coyote or a wolf. Our brother and his wife work very hard, especially now that Mr. Langer is semi-retired and John is taking over more and more of his workload. They deserve to have time away from any kind of interference, especially that of a little brother. Whatever you say and however you put it, I'm still going to go. So there. The traps they checked yielded 3 fat wild rabbits and a small black-tailed deer, which Jonathan released back into the wild after ensuring that the animal wasn't injured. It was lucky because only the tip of its tail had been caught by the trap, and the animal wisely chose to just sit quietly beside the trap until Jonathan showed up and released it. Once she was free, she gave Jonathan a soft look with her beautiful doe eyes and then disappeared into the undergrowth. Jeremiah protested loudly. That animal looked really fat and fine. Why did you let it go? It wasn't even running away from you when you let it go. You should have grabbed it. Because my dear greedy little brother, that's a doe and I don't kill those unless they are badly injured. What you think is fatness is actually pregnancy, and she'll soon have a fawn or two, which will add to the population of deer out here. She also knew that I intended her no harm, and that's why she wasn't fighting me at all. You need to learn that we are responsible for nature's resources and should take good care of them, including wild animals. Suitably chastised, Jeremiah looked at his brother with new respect in his eyes. I've never thought of it like that. All I see when I look at an animal is a juicy piece of steak, but now my eyes have been opened. Black-tailed deer are very tasty. That I agree, and I wouldn't mind a juicy steak myself. But we have to be careful not to deplete their numbers out of greed. I usually hunt the stags only because one is enough to populate a number of does. Don't worry, I'll go out and find you a large stag, and you can have all the steak you want. That would be wonderful. Now how about you show me the cave? Stop it already. Jonathan shook his head in exasperation. His youngest brother could be a nag, but he always meant well. Do this. Hold these rabbits as I fix the traps again, and then we can go and see Abby. He saw the crestfallen look on the younger man's face. When you return from Chicago, ask me again, and if my mood is agreeable, I'll show you the cave. A smile immediately broke out on Jeremiah's face. He was so easy to please, and Jonathan often worried that people would take advantage of him. But he also comforted himself with the thought that as long as the 6 of them, plus their 3 sisters, in-law were around, the boy should be fine. The Rushers always looked out for each other. Chapter 2. Facing Rejection. The first thing that Sophia Tenderfoot noticed when she set foot in her bedroom after returning home from work was that someone had gone through her stuff again. To the ordinary eye, nothing seemed out of place, but she knew better. From when she was little, she'd always been able to tell if someone had tampered with her stuff, no matter how well they put everything back. Her half-sisters had even nicknamed her the Colored Witch because she always seemed to find out when they'd done something wrong. The name annoyed her, but no amount of scolding by their mother would get them to stop, and she'd long since learned to just ignore them. Her lips tightened as she went through everything and noticed that her 2 new blouses were missing. She'd bought them with her hard-earned cash, and it irked her no end that her sisters showed no respect for her property. They always imagined that they had a right to help themselves to whichever items of her property took their fancy. The lock on her door was broken, and she always forgot to get it fixed. But not anymore. She would find Giles, their gardener, and ask him to fix the door, or she would continue to lose more of her precious items. It wasn't that she minded sharing things with Pamela and Alice, who were 18 and 16 respectively. It was the fact that they never asked for anything, but just helped themselves to whatever they desired that bothered her. Their latest interference annoyed her so much because she hadn't even worn the blouses yet. For a moment she thought of going to report them to their mother, but then decided not to. It would only make matters worse if she told their mother what the younger girls had done this time. Mama would scold the 2 girls, who would in turn sulk for days, and when their father noticed their long faces, he would ask his mother to come over and find out what was wrong. Nana Barbara Kincaid would then arrive, and the house would be in turmoil for days until she left. She lived about 2 miles down the road from them, but sometimes Sophia felt as if she lived with them. The woman only needed the slightest of excuses, and she would then move her habitation to her son's household. With a sigh, Sophia sat on her bed and counted out the money she had made that day. $30 in tips wasn't a bad way to end the day at a job that paid $10 a week. Working as a children's guide at the Boston Museum had its perks, like generous tips from happy parents whose little ones enjoyed the stories she told and displays she showed them. It was a fulfilling job for her, but her stepfather frowned upon women working. That made her all the more determined to work hard and one day be independent of him. Nana Barbara was no better. No good girl who expects to be married someday works out there, brushing shoulders with men of all kinds. Decent girls stay at home and learn how to knit, sew, cook, and keep house. She had said often enough that Sophia learned to tune her out whenever she started berating her for desiring to be a career woman. Sophia wasn't rebellious by nature, but lately she'd been feeling out of sorts, especially since she turned 21 a few weeks ago. It was as though all the feelings she'd suppressed over the years were just fighting to explode out of her, and she wondered how long it would take before she blew up. Her sisters seemed to be goading her into losing all the control she'd tightly held onto until now. Anger lies in the bosom of fools. The preacher in church had said one Sunday morning not so long ago, but she doubted that he'd had to live with two nosy and troublesome sisters. After dragging her small writing cabinet across the door to ensure she wouldn't be disturbed, she pushed her bed aside and knelt down. No one knew that she had pried loose one of the wooden tiles under the bed and created a small secret compartment to hide money and precious jewelry that her mother bought her. Since she cleaned her own room, none of the servants were privy to her secrets, and the $30 joined the nearly $300 already lying in the hiding place. She was saving so she could one day leave her stepfather's house, but she still had a long way to go. Independence meant having a job that enabled one to rent their own place, but so far she was still on the bottom rung of the pay grade scale. But for her mother, she would have left long ago and moved into a hostel, but those that she could afford were terrible. She couldn't afford the high-cost ones, so she had to be content with living at home. Living under this roof was stressful, to say the least. In her earlier years, she hadn't really paid attention to the prejudice going on around her because her mother had shielded her from so much of its ugliness. But when she turned 16, she had started asking questions, chief of which why her skin tone was darker than that of her parents and siblings. It all started when a boy in school called her the offspring of a barbaric Indian, and she hit him hard, causing his nose to bleed. She was suspended from school for 1 week, and all George Kincaid did was look at her through his cold gray eyes. Her mother was practically in tears. "What were you thinking, Sophia?" "That silly boy called me the offspring of a barbaric Indian. What was I supposed to do? Just sit back and let him insult me like that." Noticing her husband's disapproving look, Deborah Kincaid took her eldest daughter's hand and led her to her bedroom. "It's time I told you the truth because you're now a big girl, Sophia. I've done my best to protect you, but that isn't fair to you. You need to know who you really are." "What is it, Ma? Am I adopted?" Deborah threw her head back and laughed. "My darling child, you're such a romantic soul. Why would you think you're adopted?" Sophia shrugged. "I noticed that Nana Barbie doesn't like me, and Pa barely pays any attention to me like he does with Pam and Alice." "Am I not your child?" "You're just imagining things," her mother said, but wouldn't meet her eyes. "Then why do I feel as though everyone treats me different?" Deborah took a deep breath and then nodded. The time for the truth had come, no matter how painful. You're not adopted, but Mr. Kincaid isn't your real pa. What? Sophia had long suspected this, but hearing it from her mother's own lips made her feel even worse. "Are you my mother? My real mother? "Of course I am." Deborah hugged her briefly, then pushed her dark hair away from her face. "Ma, Where is my real pa then, if Mr. Kincaid isn't my father?" She felt badly when she saw the tears in her mother's eyes and the sorrow that she'd noticed from time to time. "Your pa's name was Adam Tenderfoot. He died 6 months before you were born." "How?" The question was loaded and Deborah tried to answer it as best as she could. "Years ago, just after the Civil War, I went to Nevada as a mail-order bride, but the white man I was to marry died from ague before I got there. So I met Adam Tenderfoot, your father, who was half French and half Paiute. We fell in love and got married, and those were the best 8 months of my life." Her voice had dropped to a whisper, and Sophia felt her pain. She reached out a hand and took her mother's, entwining their fingers. "What happened to my pa?" "Adam contracted the measles and died when I was 3 months pregnant with you. I've never known such pain and anguish as I did then. Burying your father and with you on the way nearly killed me. Ma, I'm very sorry. Did Pa have any family, or was he all alone?" "Yes, he had family, and a large one at that. His mother's name is White Eagle, and her older brother, who was the chief then. Those are his closest relatives. Besides them, there are many aunts, uncles, and cousins. White Eagle was a guide for some French explorers and fell in love with one of them, and they got married in secret, but under Paiute customs. When the explorers left to return to France, your grandma found out that she was with child. She wrote to Eugene, and he sent her enough money to make the journey to France so they could get married in church, but your grandmother refused to go. She is a very stubborn woman, and you take after her in so many ways. Why didn't Grandma want to go to the man she loved and the father of her child? He was her husband, and she should have gone to him." Sophia's voice was filled with indignation. It wasn't fair that her father had had to grow up without his father. Because she loves her people so much, and being one of the few educated Paiute women, she believed that her rightful place was with her people. It was her mission in life to bring enlightenment to them, and especially the women. So my father had to grow up without his father. Did he ever try to find out where my grandfather was? Not that I know of, because the topic never came up while I was married to him. He'd accepted that he belonged to Paiute and lived among them in peace until the day he died. He was a doctor, but one who also knew of the traditional Indian healing ways. And yet he wasn't able to cure himself when he got ill. Sophia sensed the underlying anger in her mother's words. "I always told him to be careful when treating patients, but he didn't listen to me. Why didn't you stay with the family after Pei died?" "Because White Eagle found out that one of the elders, who was your father's cousin, had asked for my hand in marriage, and the chief was willing to let that man have me. The problem was that I married Adam for love and couldn't bear to be someone else's wife so soon after his death, and especially not his relative, who already had 2 other wives. Your granduncle only agreed to the proposal because rejecting One-Eyed Hawk would have caused a lot of tension, which was something he wanted to avoid. You see, many of the clan members had succumbed to the measles with Adam, and that left those loyal to Chief Black Bear very vulnerable. One-Eyed Hawk was playing power games and seeking an excuse to start his own civil war among the clan and unseat the chief. Oh, Ma, so what did you do? White Eagle managed to sneak me out of the reservation and onto a Conestoga wagon, which was part of a caravan that was returning to the east. As you know, this was right after the Civil War, and there were no trains going that far yet. I kept praying that the wicked man wouldn't follow and catch up with us. He was determined to have me as his 3rd wife, and I was so scared of him. Because he had one eye? Deborah chuckled. No, child, he had both his eyes. The name was just what people called him, and I never found out why. It was a long and difficult journey, and I nearly lost you and my life, but by God's grace I survived and returned to my family here in Boston. What about Mr. Kincaid, my stepfather? Did you love him as much as you loved my pa? You have to understand that in those years, life was hard for a single mother, even though she was a widow. My parents were so aristocratic that the thought of their daughter having been married to an Indian man was like a slap in their faces. But Pa had French blood in him too, or didn't they consider that? Child, life then was so different from what it is now and when you were born. It was like the last straw. I had to go and live with my grandmother for a while because they couldn't bear to look upon you. While I was living with your grandmother, I met Mr. Kincaid, who was a widower, but his wife had died without giving him any children. You were 4 years old, and since he promised us a good home, I agreed to be his wife. But I didn't know that his mother was as puritanical as my own parents, maybe even worse. Sophia drew closer to her mother and rested her head on her shoulder. I'm sorry that you had to bear so much because of me, Ma. One day, I'll make you happy and proud of me. Deborah turned and cupped her daughter's face in her palms. I'm so proud of you and happy, and if I had to do it all over again, I would without any hesitation. You're my precious jewel, and I love you so much. I know that your sisters are sometimes so unfair because they've been taught how to be prejudiced against those they don't understand, but they are your blood. Please don't hate them. Ma, I could never hate them. They exasperate me, but they are still my little sisters, and I just wish things were different between us. That's all on your grandmother. My step-grandmother, you mean? Sophia? Ma, do you love George Kincaid? For all his faults, George is a good man, and I married him because he was the only one in our social group who didn't shun me for having been previously the wife of an Indian. French Indian, Sophia insisted on defending her dead father. My father was half French and half Indian. All right then. Deborah sighed inwardly. Your stepfather has tried his best to give you a home, and even if you don't see eye to eye on many things, he deserves your respect. Sophia didn't want to argue with her mother, so she kept silent. That was 5 years ago, and now at 21, she felt that the time to find her father's people, her own people, had come. As soon as her mother had told her what her father's surname was, she dropped the Kincaid name and taken up Tenderfoot. No amount of scolding, punishment, or tears from her mother had made her change her mind. In the end, everyone just let it go, and that was a small victory for her. But it also further alienated her from her stepfather and Nana Barbie, who felt that she was flaunting her Indian parentage before them. Couldn't they just accept that she was her father's daughter instead of pretending? In any case, her skin tone told a story of its own. Touching the small pendant which had been hanging from a string around her neck for nearly 2 months now, she smiled. It had belonged to her father, and her mother had given it to her on the day she celebrated her 21st birthday. It had to be done in secret so as not to arouse the anger of her Nana Barbie, and she kept it hidden under her clothes all the time. The only chance she got of taking it out was when she was alone, like now. Keep it very safe, for it was your father's. White Eagle has a similar one, and if you ever go searching for her, this is one of the things that will make it easy for you to identify her, her mother had told her as she handed the pendant over to her. She got a strong piece of string and hung it around her neck. Is my grandmother still alive, do you think? White Eagle promised me that she wouldn't return to the Great Spirit until she had set eyes on her son's only offspring. I tried to keep in touch, but with communication being the way it was in those days, I doubt that any of the letters I sent ever got to its destination. Then, after I got married to Mr. Kincaid, I stopped trying. But I pray that for your sake, White Eagle is still alive. From the time I told you the truth when you were 16, you've been restless, and I know that it's just a matter of time before you want to go and find your father's family. When that time comes, I won't stop you, but I hope it isn't for a long while yet. And her mother had been right. She wanted to belong with people who would accept and love her, not merely tolerate her presence. If her mother hadn't been equally stubborn and insisted on her being treated right, Sophia doubted that she would have survived in the Kincaid household. It was time to go to the West and find her roots, or whatever was left of them. Chapter 3. The Longing Heart. Jonathan cleaned the small shed behind his cabin in readiness for the next lot of jerky that he wanted to prepare. Winter was coming, and the animals would soon either migrate south to warmer climates or go into hibernation, and there would be nothing left to hunt. Though they received very little snow in woodland, winters could be severely cold because of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Woodland wasn't that close to the range, but they still felt the harsh effects of winter and the wild winds. At least they hadn't had severe and devastating storms in about 2 years, and for that, everyone was glad. The last one had nearly blown their whole house apart, and it had taken them months to rebuild and get things back to normal again. While Jonathan knew that they wouldn't starve even if severe winter set in, he didn't want Jed and Abby to strain themselves to feed the family, which was growing. Though John and Kate had moved to live with her father, who had purchased about 100 acres of land and built a beautiful mansion on it, Joshua and Beth still depended on Jed and the farm to provide for them. Just a few days ago, while checking on his traps, he'd spotted the tracks of a large male bear whose fur would make a good winter jacket for himself, and the remaining bits could be made into hats and mittens for the little additions to the family, and the large supply of meat once cured would take them through winter and hopefully up to early spring. What made Jonathan such a skilled hunter was the fact that he was also a very patient man. He would stalk an animal for days, learn its habits, and when it was at its weakest moment, he would strike. After finding the bear tracks, he'd tracked it for nearly a week and knew where it was preparing to go into hibernation. The changing weather made it lethargic, and he needed to strike soon, but he had to first clean and prepare the shed. It was a large animal, and if there was one thing he'd learned in the nearly 8 years that they'd been living on the farm was that it was wrong to waste any food. And fresh meat went bad very quickly, so it had to be properly handled and cured if it was to last a long time. In the first 2 years after they'd arrived here, they had nearly starved to death, because at the time they didn't know how to properly store grains and meat for the lean winter months. He was now wiser, as were all his brothers, and with Joshua's help, had built a very sturdy and strong storage shed. The thick walls and heavy door kept coyotes, wolves, and foxes away from the family rations. Anybody home? Jonathan was startled out of his thoughts by his brother Josiah's booming voice. For a brief moment, he thought about remaining silent so Josiah would think he wasn't around and leave, but then he felt like he wasn't being kind. They were his family after all, and meant well, even though one person or the other often strayed this way to check up on him every single day. Back here in the shed, he called out and soon heard his brother coming around. "What are you doing?" Josiah peered into the semi-darkness and then stepped in once he'd spotted Jonathan. "Sorry for disturbing your peace, but this place stinks." He wrinkled his nose in disgust. "Indeed it does. I'm just trying to clean it up for the next batch of rations. After getting rid of all this stuff, I intend to air it out for about 3 days so the bad smells go away, Did you need something? Yes. Mrs. Dickens is at the house and she wants to buy some pelts to make winter hats and gloves, and Abby sent me to find you. Does that woman think I own all the rabbits and badgers in these woods? She mentioned something about fox hides, too. Jonah grunted and muttered under his breath, but Josiah knew it was all for show. In truth, Jonathan liked trading with Laura Dickens. She was a fashion designer who'd come to Woodland 2 years ago as a mail-order bride. She'd immediately opened up the first modern clothing store, which supplied stylish clothes for men, women, and children. But when she'd found out that Jonah was a good hunter, she'd commissioned him to supply her with pelts, which she made into ladies' hats and handbags, which she then sold to a large store in Sacramento. Her merchandise was not only high quality, but it was fairly priced, and the orders just kept rolling in. Laura's Fashions was booming, and everyone was happy. Jonathan also had a tidy bank account. I know that you like Laura Dickens, so you can stop all that mumbling. Josiah ducked as Jonathan tossed an old bone at him and ran out of the shed, laughing loudly. Come on, Jonah, let's go and make the hat maker happy. According to the standards of any normal 25-year-old man, Jonathan felt that he was doing well. He'd been living on his own now for months, and with the help of his brothers, now had properly furnished his house. Abby had thrown in some doilies, and Beth provided drapes and quilts so that his little cabin finally felt like home. The cabin had previously been one large room, but he'd added 2 more rooms on one side to make bedrooms, then partitioned the original room into 3. He now had a nicely spaced kitchen, a combined living and dining room, and even a small study which housed a regular desk, chair, and built-in shelves along one wall. He wasn't the reader of the family, but he also liked books, and a few of them lined the shelves in his den. He'd also mounted the stuffed heads of various animals he'd caught on the walls. These were his trophies, and he proudly displayed them, but in the den so as not to scare his little nephew. It was a cozy little room, and he sometimes went in there just to look at his achievements over the years. While he was proud of his accomplishments, he often felt that it was all for nothing. Would he ever find a companion who understood and loved him in spite of his secret fears? He'd kept them hidden from his brothers for years, and they were now part of him. It was early evening, and he was wondering what to prepare for his dinner. He could always go down to Abby or Beth's place, or ride his horse across town to visit John and Kate. But that would mean spending hours conversing, and right now, all he wanted was some peace and quiet. So he went into his den and sat down on the small couch he provided for himself to relax on for times like this. He would take care of dinner later. Reaching up a hand to ruffle through his red hair, he sighed. He was different, and even though people said he looked like his brothers, it always felt like they were merely humoring him. He preferred his life in the woods, where no animals whispered amongst themselves as they compared his hair to that of all his brothers. Both their parents, like his brothers, had also been dark-haired, and being the only redhead among them all had felt very odd. In his earlier years, it hadn't mattered so much, but then all this changed one day. He was 10 years old at the time and had been ill, and so couldn't go to church with his parents and brothers. Feeling hungry, he'd wandered from the bedroom intending to go and find himself something to eat from the kitchen, and that's when he overheard his paternal grandmother talking to one of her friends. From a very tender age, Jonathan had always felt that Grandma Beta treated him differently from his brothers, but it wasn't until that particular day that he found out the reason why. It wasn't that she was hostile or anything. No, but she usually looked at him as if she didn't approve of him, and he'd quickly learned to stay out of her way. Hiding behind the curtain, he'd listened and heard the words that had changed his life forever. As I was saying, Magdalene, for a long time, I've had doubts that Jonathan is truly Jacob's son. Beta, why would you say something as terrible as that? The woman called Magdalene sounded truly horrified. Don't ever let anyone hear you saying that. Your son loves all his children equally, and planting such ideas in the minds of people can cause a lot of pain and anguish. Magda, don't tell me that even you haven't often wondered that the boy is different from my son, his wife, and his brothers, too. How so? The color of his hair. It's red, and no one in my family or my late husband's family had red hair. The color of a person's hair depicts one's parentage. What about your daughter-in-law? Jenny's family could have had some red-haired people. I don't think so, because she would have said something by now. Her family is probably also dark-haired, but she's never spoken about them, so we can never tell. That woman stepped out on my son, and that I'm quite sure of. But my boy turns a blind eye to his wife's faults. Nothing I try to tell him will make him think of her as anything less than an angel, yet we all know that Jenny is no angel. Not with that boy in the family. Beta, be very careful, because words once spoken cannot be recalled. Leave your boy, his wife and children be. If Jenny ever did him wrong, then it's not evident in the way he treats the child. Jacob has accepted the child, and so just leave it at that. But from that moment onwards, Jonathan began to wonder if indeed he wasn't his father's son. Then who was his father? Like Magdalene had said, his father treated them all equally, and he never once felt discriminated against or shunned. But that didn't stop him from wondering if perhaps his grandmother had been right. He'd longed to ask his parents to tell him the truth, but before he could gather the courage to do so, they were both dead, as was his grandmother. So he simply kept everything bottled up, his secret within himself. He also looked for signs from his brothers to show that they thought he was different from them, but found none. Yet he wasn't confident that he belonged with them. What if he courted a girl and she started asking why he seemed different? What would he tell her? What would he tell her? Would the truth then come out? Did Jedediah, as the oldest, know anything about all this? Chapter 4. Off to the Wild West. It breaks my heart to see you leave, but I can't stop you. Deborah held her eldest daughter close for a final hug. I've been praying that this day never comes, but it has. I'll be praying for you. Thank you, Mama, Sophia whispered huskily, struggling not to cry. Did she really know what she was doing? Was this the right way to go about fulfilling the desires of her heart? Would finding her father's family quench the restlessness within her? What if, when she found them, they didn't want anything to do with her? 21 years was a long time, and if her grandmother was dead, would anyone even remember her father, let alone the fact that his wife left while she was pregnant? Pushing all the questions aside, she smiled at her mother. I'll be all right, Ma. I promise you that, and I'll write to you every day. Just be safe and take care of yourself. Travel in these days isn't like what it was in the past, and if you want to come back home, trains run in all directions at all times. The doors are always wide open for you. Yes, Ma, Sophia said, though she knew that returning to Boston wasn't an option. No way was she going to allow her stepfather and his mother to view her like the prodigal daughter returning home after being defeated by life. Never again would she live under the roof of the man who preferred to ignore her very existence, or half-sisters who were so jealous that they wanted to see her fail at everything. The sudden blast of the train's whistle startled them both, and suddenly everyone was scrambling towards the train doors. Deborah hurried her daughter to the first-class coach and saw her in, then just stood there with tears pouring unashamedly down her face. "I love you." She blew her a kiss, and Sophia ran to her compartment so she could lean out of the window and wave to her mother. As the train started moving out of the station, Deborah ran alongside until she got to the end of the platform. Sophia waved back until her mother was a mere speck in the distance. When there was nothing more to see, she raised the window but didn't completely shut it. The luxury of a first-class compartment was at the insistence of her mother, as was the nearly $500 she's pressed into her hands. She also had close to $700 sewn into the lining of her new jacket, another gift from her mother. Because she had no idea where her journey would lead, she had chosen not to carry much luggage, and all she had was a carpet bag, which contained a few dresses and undergarments, and her purse. She would purchase whatever else she needed as she went along, but she also had to be careful with the money she had. The last thing she wanted was to be stranded in a foreign land with no money and then have to write to her mother to send her more. No, she wasn't going to give George Kincaid and his mother any more reasons to mock her. She let her tears fall as she thought that it might be the last time she would probably ever see her mother. Maybe the poor woman could finally settle down and have a normal life at home, not one filled with strife and tension all the time, no doubt because of her. Not knowing what the future held was really frightening, but Sophia was determined that she would find her people, or at least someone who could tell her what had happened to them in the past 21 years. Her fingers played with her pendant, and she finally stopped crying to think about never having to deal with her austere step-grandmother again. She also allowed herself to feel relieved that she was no longer under the Kincaid household. Her mother would miss her, but they would write to each other. As she'd so rightly pointed out, these days communication was faster and better, and trains ran in all directions. Perhaps when she found her people, she would write and invite her mother to visit her. Not that she expected that her stepfather would allow her to travel, but she was still filled with sadness at the way she had parted with her sisters. Pam and Alice had shown no signs of distress when their mother announced that Sophia was leaving. If anything, they had scrambled for whatever she was leaving behind. Were all sisters like that, and if so, how did people cope with them? When Pam and Alice were born, no one was prouder than Sophia to have little sisters to look up to her. She'd dreamed of being a loving big sister, and for a while that had been the case. She missed the days when they would braid each other's hair and share clothes. But Nana Barbie soon put an end to that and turned the two younger girls against her. Her mother had tried to keep them close, but Nana's convictions were louder and they obeyed her more. They did all they could to please her, because she seemed to hold all the cards in as far as the family was concerned. Though Pam was only 17, she was already engaged to the son of a family friend. Coming from a family of Boston Brahmins like the Kincaids, Carter Johnson was thoroughly spoilt and a mother's boy. Had circumstances been different, Sophia might have advised her sister against getting married to Carter, who was just a man-child. Her sister would never be happy with that man, and Sophia was sure that Pam knew that. But her stepfather seemed happy enough with the match. Maybe they knew something she didn't, but according to her, it was a disaster waiting to happen. When it came to her own situation, none of the Brahmin's sons or brothers were willing to sully their pure white blood with her own Indian-stained one. Marriage to a dark-skinned woman was out in as far as they were concerned, but they weren't averse to having illicit trysts with her, and a few had unashamedly made the offer. They received such a rebuff that they never approached her again, but one even started a nasty rumor about her. She'd gotten even with him when she found out that he was engaged and still running around with soiled doves. A simple word in the right ear, and the man had been found in a very compromising situation. Seeing him shamed had made Sophia giggle and feel victorious, but only for a brief moment. She could never figure out how her mother had found out that it was her who leaked out the information to the man's fiancé, but she would never forget her words. It is in the discretion of a wise man to hide a matter, her parent had told her. Only fools blurt out what they feel is the truth and shame others. Even if what you leaked out is true, you had no right to do that, Sophia. Rise above other people's prejudices and bad character. When you soil your hands and lips with gossip like that, how different are you from them? Sophia had wanted to go and apologize to the man and his fiancée, but once again, her wise mother stopped her. Let the scandal die down for it, surely will. Something else will come up and take the place of that nasty business, but I hope you've learned your lesson. And she really had. After that incident, she was very careful about what she said and who she said it to, not wanting to stir up more trouble and cause her mother distress. She also accepted that the men in Boston who were of the same social standing as her family would never marry her, and she resigned herself to the fact that she might be single for the rest of her life. However, she now had hope that things might change since she was going west. Perhaps her Indian grandmother would guide her to find a suitable mate among her own people, but she hoped it wouldn't be someone who was so steeped in his culture and traditional ways that he refused to accept progress. On the other hand, what if her Indian relatives also didn't want their own blood sullied by a mixed marriage? They might want to maintain their pure blood. Would she never catch a break? "We're sorry, but we have no idea where the clan could have moved to," was the response Sophia got days later when she began her quest for her family. Landing in Woodland at her mother's suggestion made her no closer to finding her people. She'd even gone as far as the reservations around the town because the good lady at the inn had told her that a tribe of Indians had lived there, but years ago. Her mother had pointed her to Woodland because White Eagle had told her that they had many relatives in that part of California. It was the best place to begin her search, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. Disease and hostilities with pioneers has seen Indian tribes moving in all directions, so we can't really tell. Just keep trying and you might get lucky, Mrs. Maple at the inn told her when she returned disappointed once again. She'd been searching for days and was in despair. At one point, she wanted to weep in frustration, but throwing a tantrum was childish, as her mother would say, and wouldn't solve anything. She had to be strong and keep looking. But her money was fast running out, and once it was gone, she had no idea what she was going to do. Having over $1,000 when she first arrived had seemed like a lot of money at the time, but hiring chases and buggies to take her around, buying new clothes, and not to mention the rent at the inn was eating into her savings so fast that if she wasn't careful, everything would soon be gone. Woodland was a growing town, and there were many stores and businesses open. She could see a lawyer's officer and an assayer's chambers too, though it was empty. No one had told her of any minerals being found in this place, and she shrugged as she walked on. Her throat felt dry after the long walk she'd taken, but she would have to wait until she returned to the inn to take something. She couldn't afford to spend any money on frivolities like the sweet ginger ale that her mother had kept cooled in an icebox back at home. Oh, what she wouldn't do for a glass of the refreshing beverage! She shook her head and continued with her journey, spying a newspaper office and a dress shop, which had beautiful hats and frocks on sale. Laura's Fashions had beautiful displays in the windows, and she deliberately walked on the other side of the street so as not to be tempted into spending any more of her remaining funds. The Woodland Herald beckoned, and she walked into the newspaper office. Sometimes one found what they were looking for in old newspapers, and at this point she was desperate enough to try anything. There was a tall and handsome man running one of the printing presses, and he stopped when he saw her. "Why, hello there." He wiped his inky hands on a dirty rag and came forward. "Welcome to the Woodland Herald. Do you want to place an advert or something?" She shook her head, blushing at the way he was staring at her. But it wasn't a lecherous look like she'd gotten from the men back in Boston. It was an open look, but one filled with curiosity, as if he'd like to ask her many questions, but didn't know where to begin. "I'd just like some information if you can give it to me." "Right. Would you like to sit?" Then he laughed. "Sorry, my name is Hugo Grant, and this is my newspaper, at least for the last 2 years." "My name is Sophia Tenderfoot," she said, hoping her Indian surname would mean something to him. Apparently it didn't, but he waited for her to sit down. "How may I help you?" "Sophia Tenderfoot." "I'm searching for my grandmother. She's a Paiute Indian, and this town is the last known address for her family." Well, he laughed, a deep, pleasant sound. "I don't know much about Indian tribes because, sadly, I'm like all pale faces, as they call us. We think they are all the same, so I can't help you out there. But there used to be a reservation beyond the hills, about 10 miles from here. Riding out there would be best, but since I've never been there, I don't know if they are the people you seek." Then he frowned slightly. "I'm not even sure the reservation still has people." "Why?" "A lot happens in such a short time, and most of the Indian tribes are always on the move. They might be there or could probably have moved to some other town or even state. The Indians migrate a lot, and finding one particular tribe can be quite a formidable task unless you have specific information as to their whereabouts. I think I should check out that reservation you mentioned. There still might be people living there, and even if it's not those I seek, at least someone might have some information for me. All I hope is to find at least one Indian clan, and hopefully they might have information that will lead me to finding my grandma. I wish you all the best, but if you have any other questions, I'll be glad to help. Come back here at any time." He saw the look on her face and tried to cheer her up. "Don't despair. You might be lucky and find someone who will guide you to your destination. Also have faith in God that as He's brought you this far, He will see you to the end. Amen, and thank you for your advice and time." Leaving the newspaper office, she wondered where she would find a horse, and then saw the sign that said someone had horses for short-term hire. Riding couldn't be all that hard, she thought, looking around and seeing ladies like her comfortably seated astride on horses. Those who didn't have the proper attire sat side saddle, but one thing was clear. They were all very much at home on horses. "I'd like to hire a horse to ride out to the hills," she told the wiry man who answered her summons when she tugged on the dangling rope that rang the bell. "I would like to visit the reservation on the other side. How much will it cost me?" "Will you be gone the whole day or just half day?" "Half day, please." He mentioned a certain sum, and though it would further deplete her resources, she was desperate. Besides, it was for a good reason, and she wasn't wasting it. "That amount will be fine." She pulled her small purse out of her deep pocket and counted out the money he'd asked for. He took it and immediately placed it in his back pocket, as if expecting her to ask for it back. But she wasn't changing her mind at all. She'd come too far to quit. "Well, my horses know their way home, and they can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you tether the mare very well. If she finds out that she's free, she'll leave you out in the wilderness and come back home. And there will be no refund for that." His old face looked stern. "No refund at all." "I understand," she said, praying that she wouldn't fall off the horse or that it wouldn't abandon her out in the wilderness. Do you know how to ride?" "Not very well, sir." "Then I'll give you this old mare that is slow but sure-footed. But like I warned, don't leave her free." He provided her with a stool she could use to get onto the horse, and after showing her how to handle the reins, he helped her up. "Take good care of yourself and my horse." "Thank you, sir. I will." There's a shortcut to the reservation. Though it's been a while since I've seen folk coming from there. But no matter, they may have decided to use the towns on the other side and closer than Woodland. If you'd like to use the shortcut, it cuts through the Rusher farm, though I wouldn't advise you to go that way. Those boys can be hostile when it comes to strangers, but that route is nearer. Or else just follow this road as far as it goes, and there's a small sign. But you have to look out for it. I wish you all the best, and make sure you bring my horse back without any injuries." "Yes, sir. I'll do that." Getting up on a horse was easy, but riding it was harder than she thought, and she was glad she was wearing breeches under her wide dress. Feeling a little self-conscious about sitting astride the horse, she was thankful that no one in this little town knew her. Sophia felt the man watching her as she rode out of town in the direction Hugo had pointed, and soon she left everything behind. But the horse was heavy and quite lazy, and she kept prodding its side to get it moving. Much as she would have liked to spend time gazing at the beautiful farms and ranches along the road, she had a journey to complete and so kept her face looking straight ahead. At some point, she came to the end of cultivated farmland and continued trekking through the wilderness, but not once was she scared of what lay ahead. She was burning with curiosity and excitement, and the desire to find her grandmother overrode any fears she might have had. Just when she thought she'd left all civilization behind, she came upon a small broken sign that pointed her in the direction of the reservation. Heart pounding, she led the horse in that direction, but soon felt overwhelmed by despair when she got there. It was a ghost village and stood at the edge of the forest. Not a living thing stirred, and she got off the horse so she could walk around the place. The adobe houses all had huge cracks on the walls, and some had even fallen flat, and all that was left of them were ruins. It must have been a pretty place while people lived here, but right now it made her feel sad. These might have been her people, but circumstances had forced them to abandon their home. How had they felt as they left their homes for the last time? She was sure some woman had wept over her failed dreams and future. The ground looked so hard, and Sophia wondered how the tribe had survived. Had they been hunters, or had they at one point cultivated the land? No answers were forthcoming, but she guessed that they must have made their living by hunting in the thick forest. In the late afternoon sun, the place looked eerie, and she decided to leave. Looking around for a rock or something on which to stand, she made the mistake of letting go the reins of the mare. The animal gave a single neigh and took off like a shot, surprising her because of her speed. She nearly fell off the rock. Oh no! Sophia felt like crying. What was she going to do? Riding out here had taken her nearly 3 hours, and the day was far spent. She would just have to find her way back on foot, or else find somewhere to spend the night until the morrow. But the deserted reservation wasn't the place to be, because she couldn't be sure that wild animals wouldn't stray in and feast on her. And as far as she could tell, none of the buildings that were still standing had doors or windows, for that matter. There might also be vagabonds on the loose, and a woman alone was easy prey for them. Then she remembered the shortcut that the horse owner had told her about and decided to try and find it. She found herself entering the forest and following an old path that clearly hadn't been used in a long time. It must have been used by the inhabitants of the reservation, but now that they were gone, no one had clearly walked along it for a while. The trees provided a thick canopy that shielded her from whatever was left of the sun, and she found herself thinking that under different circumstances, she would have enjoyed watching the colorful birds that darted from branch to branch. This was nature, and she loved it. Somehow, she wasn't scared of being alone in the woods. This was the land of her forefathers, and she felt at peace with nature. Small animals scurried around in the undergrowth, and at one point she thought she spied a family of rabbits watching her and then giggled at her imagination. If she wasn't so tired, she might have skipped along the path, imagining that her relatives had probably done so as they went in search of animals for meat or wild fruit. Not for the first time, Sophia thanked Talia, their Negro cook, for having taught her survival skills. Years ago, Talia and her 3 children had walked from Milledgeville in Georgia 3 years before the Civil War broke out. Her husband was killed by his white master when he was protecting her from being flogged. Using the Underground Railroad with many other runaway slaves, they had to trek hundreds of miles to safety. She had often told Sophia of the nights they spent in forests, hiding from scouts and bounty hunters who were sent to bring them back to their masters. She had learned how to catch and prepare wild meat and had passed on those skills to Sophia. Sophia could skin a rabbit and pluck the feathers off all kinds of fowl, even with her eyes closed. She wasn't squeamish at the sight of blood and animal entrails like her sisters, so she wasn't worried about getting herself something to eat, at least for a day or two, as she made her way back to the town. The silly horse had probably returned to its owner, who she knew wouldn't bother finding out what had happened to her. Mrs. Maple had kept her carpetbag upon request, and it contained her few belongings, which she hoped would be safe. But the leather satchel bag that she'd bought upon her arrival and which she never left behind contained at least a change of clothing and a few toiletries. It paid to be prepared at all times, and she adjusted it over her shoulder. In it was also a small penknife that she had bought with the bag. The trader who sold it to her had told her that it was made by an Indian craftsman, and she'd bought it just to feel close to her people. But even though she was feeling courageous, she still remembered that forests and woods harbored all manner of animals, some docile and others fierce. Sierra Nevada was famous for its black grizzly bears, as well as coyotes and wolves. Without a suitable weapon, they would soon make a meal of her, but she wasn't ready to go just yet. No, she still had to find her grandmother. White Eagle, the name kept ringing in her mind, and she prayed that she wasn't years too late. She must have walked for close to 2 hours when she suddenly stumbled upon a wooden cabin that was surrounded by a whitewashed fence. It was neatly tucked away among the trees as if the owner didn't want to be disturbed by civilization. Built on wooden stilts, it looked like something out of a picture, remaining hidden in a thicket outside the fence. Sophia watched for any signs of life in or around the house. If the owner was in residence, shouldn't there be some smoke coming out of the chimney? But nothing stirred except a soft and gentle breeze. She must be on the rusher's land, and remembered the old man's warning that they weren't friendly to strangers. This cabin must belong to one of the workers or something. In any case, she would remain hidden until she was sure nobody would harm her. She wasn't a thief, but hunger made her stomach growl, and she was going to have to steal some food to silence it. The last meal she'd eaten was breakfast at the small inn she'd been staying at. She was very sure that there was food in that house, for it clearly wasn't deserted, not with the way the small compound was so neatly kept. There were some men's shirts hanging on the clothesline, but she didn't see any frocks. The owners were probably away working in the fields or doing something else. She would go in and help herself to something, then watch to see who the owner was and ask for their forgiveness. If she found pen and paper, she would leave a note to tell them that she had borrowed some of their food. Since she didn't see any children around, She deduced that the house owners didn't have any and prayed that there would at least be a woman. A woman might be more sympathetic and kind. Just as she was about to step out of her hiding place and approach the cabin, the front door opened and two men stepped out of it. They were both tall and broad-shouldered, but it was the red-haired one that caught her interest. He was slightly taller than his companion and had a rugged look about him. Even from this distance, she could tell that he spent many hours outdoors from his tanned skin and was what her sisters would probably call a bushman. The men back in Boston had nearly been white, but out here, most of them looked like the man standing on the small porch. But Sophia's heart started beating faster, and she suddenly felt like she couldn't breathe. What was happening to her? No man she'd ever seen or met before had had this kind of effect on her. Maybe the sun had scorched her brains out, but the sight of that red-headed man was invoking strange feelings within her. "Don't be foolish," she muttered, and then ducked when the man turned his face in her direction. She crouched lower, feeling as though he'd seen her. But the bush was so thick, and she was wearing dark clothes. In the fast-fading light, she doubted that he had spotted her, and she chuckled softly at her foolishness. She was beginning to let her imagination run wild. After a few minutes had passed and nothing happened, she rose up to peep and saw the two men walking away. The shirts were still on the clothesline, which made her know that they couldn't be going far. They were probably workers on the farm, because she didn't expect that the family would be living in the woods. Breathing a sigh of relief, she waited for them to completely disappear from view and then slowly crept towards the house, watching out for signs of their return. The door wasn't locked, and she looked around the pretty cabin. The owner had lit a small lantern and left it burning on the table in the living room, making her know that he would be back soon, so she had to hurry. The man was neat, and she spotted the kitchen. There was half a loaf of bread on the small kitchen table and something that looked like meat stew on the stove. It was still warm, a sign that the man had just had his meal. The dirty dishes in the sink were further proof of that. Because she didn't know if this man was a good person or not, she cut a chunk of the bread, scooped some meat in her hands, and dashed out of the house. But all was still. It was time for her to explore, and as she chewed on the bread, which had a pleasant taste, she walked around the house. There was a shed which was bolted from the outside, but there was no padlock to keep out any curious persons like her. So she opened it and stood in the doorway for a while to allow her eyes to get accustomed to the darkness within. The smell of dried meat assailed her nostrils, and she peered into the darkness and saw what looked like strips of rope hanging from the roof and dangling downwards. It was a storage shed of some sort, but it would do. Still, she would only creep into sleep once she was sure the man of the house was also asleep in his own bed. The last thing she wanted was to be caught sleeping in someone's shed. At the back fence, she saw a small gate that had a simple locking device and opened it. It led out to a path, but since it was dark, she didn't want to stray into the forest and get lost. But if she walked out, the man might come back and lock her out. Then what would she do? Looking around wildly to find a hiding place, she decided that the space under the cabin could easily accommodate her frame. Praying that there were no serpents waiting to strike, she quickly slid under. This would be a good hiding place, and she would wait until the man returned before slipping into the shed to sleep. From the moment Jonathan stepped out of his cabin that same evening, he got the uncanny feeling that someone or something was watching him. He wasn't scared, just merely curious, and as he turned to stare at the bushes beyond the fence on one side of his small compound, he thought he saw something move, then shook his head. In the dusk, even bushes looked like animals, but something was out there. Of that he was sure, and not a small animal. It couldn't be the large black bear because he'd killed it just 2 days ago. Evidence of that was back in his shed. He hadn't spotted any signs of another large animal, and he wondered what was out there. "What's wrong?" John asked him when he saw him scouting the surrounding area with his sharp eyes. He'd come to install a water closet for his brother in his cabin. Being the engineer of the family, his tinkering with all sorts of equipment and machinery had made life so much easier for everyone. After marrying Catherine Longer, the heiress of the Longer locomotive empire, his father-in-law had been slowly handing the reins of the business over to him, and he traveled widely in just a few months. Seeing the indoor plumbing on the train and in the hotels at which they stayed had given him ideas. He was determined to provide the same luxuries for his family. "Jonah, why are you staring into the bushes like you've seen an animal you want to hunt down?" "I thought I saw someone watching us," Jonathan said, and earned himself a mocking laugh. "Clearly, you've been alone out here for too long now, dear brother. You're seeing Indians lurking behind every thicket and bush." "I didn't say it was an Indian." "I know, but I just feel like teasing you." "Come on, Abby is waiting at home, and so is my lovely wife. It will soon be dark, and I don't like staying out for long, especially when I have Kate with me. My father-in-law hates to eat alone and will wait for us, and then eating late will give him indigestion, and we'll have to spend half the night up trying to find him some relief. Your wife doesn't mind you calling her Kate. She looks so much like a Catherine and not a Kate." It was Jeremiah and Josiah who started calling her that, and funny enough, she doesn't mind it at all. John led the way. "I always tell you that it isn't healthy to isolate yourself for long hours. Your brain will begin showing you things that aren't even there. Well, I have this feeling that we're not alone out here. There's something or someone watching us. I can still feel their gaze on us. Of course, we're not alone out here. This is a forest, and there are wild animals all around. You live in the bushes. What do you expect?" Because he didn't want to be teased any further, Jonathan decided to let the matter rest. But when he returned from having dinner with his family, he would investigate and find out what or who was lurking around his home. This was his territory and domain, and he wouldn't take too kindly to any kind of intruders, human or otherwise. Though he never used a padlock on his shed, he was sure no animals would open the door unless they were the two-legged kind with hands. The bear meat he'd cured and prepared was in there, as well as the thick fur which was about ready to be turned into a winter coat. There were also some rabbit, badger, and fox pelts waiting for Laura Dickens to come and collect. He hoped that no one would try to rob him while he was gone for a few hours, but doubted that anyone would dare. But like so many times before, he thought that perhaps it was time that he got himself a dog to stand guard during those times when he wasn't at home. "Come on, let's hurry," John said impatiently. With one final backward glance, he turned to follow his brother. Chapter 5. The Intruder. The thick fur made for a good mattress, even though it smelled funny, and Sophia was soon sleeping soundly. She'd been careful to ensure the man of the house was asleep in his own bed before she crept back to the shed and took it down from the crude shelf. He had returned hours later and done a lap around his house, no doubt searching for any suspicious characters, but she was hiding under the house itself. When she saw him go up the steps, she waited for a few more minutes before slipping out. It was only when she saw the light go off in the cabin that she had crept back to the shed and made herself as comfortable as she could. Being a light sleeper, Sophia was up before dawn and slipped back into the thicket. The strips she'd seen in the shed were jerky, and she'd tasted a little and found the taste strange, but not unpleasant. Still, she needed to hunt rabbits or wildfowl and prepare herself something to eat before she faded away due to hunger. The bread and meat of yesterday had nourished her for a while, but she was hungry again. The fresh mountain air was probably what was causing her to have such deep hunger pangs. She could always go back to Mrs. Maple's place, but there was something that was pulling her to continue hanging around the forest that she couldn't quite explain. She spent the day looking for berries or wild fruit, but was careful not to eat just anything. Working in the museum had broadened her scope of knowledge. When she noticed wild fruits that had been eaten by some animal, she would pick those and prayed that she wasn't killing herself. She spent the next few days playing a cat-and-mouse game with the cabin owner. In the evening, she would tell herself that come morning she'd be gone. But when morning came, she told herself that it would be better for her to leave when evening came. The man provided well for himself, but she was always very careful not to let him know that she was eating his food. Once, she'd even enjoyed the luxury of a long, cool bath in his apparently newly installed bathtub and then realized the risk she'd taken. What if he had returned from wherever and found her using his house like it belonged to her? She seemed to sense that he wasn't a dangerous person, but then no one liked their home space invaded. Hadn't she been like that with her sisters, getting upset when anyone entered her bedroom without her permission or took stuff without asking her? Yet here she was doing the same thing to a stranger. Once again, she'd spent the night in the shed lying on the soft, thick bear fur, for she'd eventually found out what it was. But regrettably, she had to slip out while it was still dark, so the red-haired man wouldn't come in and find her. It was a chilly morning, and she longed for her shawl that was back at the inn. Pulling her light coat around her, she set off to explore some more of the surrounding area as she waited for Mr. Red Hair to leave his house so she could go and find something to eat. Her throat was parched, and she thought that just for today she would make herself a cup of coffee in his house. I'll stay just one more day and then go back to Mrs. Maple. I might as well face the fact that my grandmother and her people are probably dead. She looked around to see if there were any traps around her, and if they contained anything. This man was good at hiding his traps not only from other animals, but human intruders as well. I wish I knew his name, she thought, as she stepped over what seemed like a small bush. She didn't know that it was a hidden trap until it was too late. She nearly fainted at the piercing pain that she felt going all through her body and opened her mouth to scream. The blood-curdling scream made Jonathan automatically reach for the rifle that leaned against the wall in his bedroom. It sounded too close to his house, and he at first thought it was a wolf or coyote, but then shook his head. It had sounded almost human. There were no hyenas in these woods, and those were the animals he knew that mimicked the human sounds. As he stepped out of his house in the early morning, he was ready to face whatever was lurking out there. For the past few days, he'd noticed strange things inside his house and even outside with his traps. At the time, he'd felt as though someone or something was inside his shed, and he'd been checking it frequently, but it was always empty. Nevertheless, there was a soft, flowery scent lingering on the bear fur. What was going on? Had he been a superstitious man, he might have thought that some fairy or mythical creature was visiting him while he was away. He at first didn't notice that he was sharing his food with someone, but then the flowery scent in his house made him wonder. Not one to measure his food, he started marking the bread he left, and sure enough, someone was cutting a chunk off each time. No matter how long he stayed up, he never managed to catch the thief. He'd also noticed that his traps were tampered with, and someone was taking a few of the animals he'd caught. But whoever it was considerate enough to always bring the pelt back, and they were very careful about it, making him know that he was dealing with someone who knew a lot about traps. Well, whoever or whatever it was about to feel the full force of his wrath. No one robbed him of his hard-found trappings. The sun was coming up fast, and he crept along the wall of his cabin, cautious and alert. Then he heard a moan and frowned. It was coming from beyond the fence towards the path behind his house, and he went to investigate. It was probably the same animal that had been tampering with his traps. The scream meant that whatever it was had been caught in one of them. Today was the day of reckoning for this thief. Lips tight, Jonathan held his rifle ready. But when he opened the small gate and had walked just a few feet down the path, he stopped in shock. There was a woman lying on the path, and she wasn't moving at all. Sure that she was the one who'd screamed moments ago, he drew closer, rifle ready for any surprise attack. His senses were also highly alert to his surroundings, just in case she wasn't alone. It could be a trick to lure him out of his cabin, so whoever it was would then attack him. As soon as he got closer, he realized that she posed no immediate threat because she was unconscious. Her breeches were soaked in blood, and at first he thought some man had molested her. Feeling very self-conscious about being in the woods alone with a badly injured and unconscious woman, he prayed that no one would come along or this whole scene would be misconstrued. His family had dealt with angry townsfolk in the past, and he was sure that someone would have him hanged if he was found in this situation. His heart slowed down when he realized that the woman hadn't been molested, but there was a sharp piece of metal sticking out of her right thigh. She had fallen on one of his deadliest traps, and if he didn't help her soon, she would be dead in no time. This was one of those he usually set to catch coyotes and wolves, but it had now caught a human. "Miss?" He tried shaking her shoulder, but she was out cold and her sickly pallor concerned him. What was he going to do? Leaving her out here as he went for help wasn't an option. Wild animals could smell fresh blood from far off and would attack her, or someone might come along and cause further damage to her. No, he would help her as much as he could, and he prayed that she wouldn't die in his arms. For then how would he explain matters to the sheriff? Not to mention his brothers. So he ripped the sleeves off his shirt. Abby would have his hide for that, but this was an emergency, and he hoped she would understand. Gently pulling the sharp prong out of the woman's thigh, he nearly jumped back when blood gashed out and shot into the air. Abby would know what to do, was his first thought as he bound the wound securely and picked the woman up. She wasn't very light, but fear of her dying in his arms gave his feet wings, and he was soon flying towards his brother's house. Abby, Jed, Josiah, Judah, anyone, Jonathan called out as he approached the house. Lucy started barking, and soon people came pouring from all directions. "What's wrong?" Jed called out. "I found her behind my cabin, and she's badly injured. She must have tripped on one of the sharp prongs of a trap, and when I pulled it out, blood gashed out. She's losing a lot of blood." "Bring her in here quick," Abby called out from the doorway. By the time Jonathan got there with the unconscious woman, she had cleared the dining table. "Place her on the table and get me gunpowder. And matches quick. We have to cauterize the wound and stop the bleeding. Quick, don't just stand there." Hours later, when the injured woman was all cleaned up, Judah and Josiah gave up their room and moved into Jeremiah's. Jonathan helped Abby prepare it and then carried her up the stairs and gently laid her on the bed. Before, he'd been too worried to look at her face, but now that she was lying in bed, he noticed that she was really beautiful. Her face just took his breath away, and he knew that for as long as he lived, this woman would never leave his heart. Who was she, and what had she been doing behind his house? Then something struck him. The same flowery scent he'd smelled in his house and shed lingered around her and he smiled. This was definitely the intruder who'd eaten his food and stolen from his traps. The idea of her being in his house and touching his things gave him an indescribable feeling. He would deal with his feelings later, but what was foremost on his mind was finding out who she was. What had she been doing there in the first place? "Did she have anything on her that we can use to identify her?" Abby asked, looking down at the woman. "No, I didn't check. When I heard her screaming and found her lying unconscious on the path, my immediate thought was to get her here to you so you would take care of her. I didn't want anyone coming along and misunderstanding what they saw and braying for my blood." Abby nodded, placing a light hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Jonathan. Your fast actions saved her life. But she lost a lot of blood. Will she be all right?" He thought that she looked rather pale. "Yes, you can already see that the color is returning to her face. We stopped the bleeding, so she should be all right as long as she doesn't move around and cause the wound to open up again. Someone will have to watch her closely so she doesn't cause more harm to herself. I should send for Beth or Kate to come and help me. I'll stay with her. It's not right for you to do so. Surrounded by everyone in the house, what do you think I could do to her?" "Jonathan, I didn't mean to sound condescending and untrusting. But this is a young woman we don't know, and we must observe all rules of propriety in case her people come searching for her. We don't want anyone to misunderstand the situation and create a scandal or trouble. The door will remain open at all times, and we don't have to broadcast it to the whole world that she is here, at least not until she is better. I'll have to ask Jed what he thinks." "You do that." Jonathan didn't know why he was feeling so protective over the unconscious woman. "Meanwhile, I'll just sit by her bedside and watch over her." And as far as he was concerned, the matter was settled. Chapter 6, Beloved Stranger. Sophia woke up feeling quite disoriented and groggy. Her right leg throbbed and she felt feverish. Her eyes wouldn't focus, and she began to thrash around in panic as she thought she'd suddenly gone blind. "You're safe now." A soft voice broke through her agitation, and she calmed down. "Where am I?" She blinked rapidly and turned towards the voice, but could only make out a hazy form. The room wasn't brightly lit, and she thought that it was probably nighttime. There was a small lantern on one of the walls that confirmed the time of day. "You're in my house." "My name is Abigail or Abby Rusher. My brother-in-law found you behind his house yesterday morning and brought you here. You were badly injured and have been unconscious since then, and I don't want you moving around or the wound might reopen." I feel so tired and thirsty. Sophia licked her dry lips, glad that things were taking shape once again. "Water, please." "In a moment. You lost a lot of blood and developed a very high fever. We had to force some willow bark juice down your throat to help with the fever." Sophia's eyesight cleared, and she saw a petite woman standing over the bed. "What were you doing out there in the forest all alone?" It's a very dangerous place to be, especially for those who don't know these parts very well. If Jonathan hadn't found you when he did, you would have been in a lot of trouble. Thank you. Sophia really longed for a drink of water. Why couldn't this woman just give her some water and stop talking so much? What's your name and where are you from? Someone must be searching for you, and we need to let them know that you're injured but fine. Grandma. The darkness was returning and her tongue felt very heavy. I have to find Grandma, please. Was she in the forest with you? Sophia shook her head against the pillow, struggling not to succumb to the beckoning darkness. She raised a weak hand and tugged hard at the pendant. The string broke, and she held it out to Abby. Sophia Tenderfoot. Sophia. Her voice was trailing away even as she felt herself slipping away. Paiute. Grandma. As soon as Abby took the pendant, Sophia once again slipped into unconsciousness. Seeing that there wasn't much else she could do for the unconscious woman, Abby straightened the bed linens and then walked out of the room. Jonathan was hovering in the doorway. How is she? Will she be all right? It's my fault. I shouldn't have laid out those traps so close to the house. What if she dies? Jonathan. Abby took his hand and led him down the stairs like a little child. Her name is Sophia Tenderfoot, and she gave me this. Abby showed him the pendant. She asked me to find her grandmother. What? Jonathan raised panic-stricken eyes to his sister-in-law. Are you telling me that there's another woman out there in the woods? We have to mount an immediate rescue and find her before she gets into trouble. Winter is coming and the animals are very agitated and could be really dangerous. Abby shook her head. I doubt that the grandmother was in the woods with her. I asked Sophia if they'd been together, but she shook her head. I think she's searching for her grandmother, who is clearly an Indian, given this pendant. Abby observed it closely. Did you notice that she has dark skin? Yes. Jonathan was still quite shaken and took the pendant from Abby, studied it briefly, and then gave it back to her. What can we do to help her? Seeing Abby acting so calm made him believe that all would be well. His sister-in-law was a very strong woman, and he could count on her. He took her hand. Thank you for being here, Abby. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. She ruffled his hair. He was like the little brother she'd never had. They all were, except for her husband. Jonathan, your young lady will be all right. Then she started chuckling. Honestly, can none of you brothers ever find a woman in conventional ways like other men? He grinned sheepishly. We're rushers and we're quite extraordinary. He took the pendant from Abby once again. Did Sophia say anything else? He held and studied it as if it could give them answers as to who that woman upstairs was. Yes, Paiute, that's what she said. The front door opened and Judah walked in. He was carrying a large book, as was his usual habit, and he placed it on the dining table. What's going on here? You both look so solemn. Did something happen to our guest? No. Jonathan's young lady woke up long enough to tell me her name and hand this to me. Abby pointed at the pendant in Jonathan's hand. She also said she was searching for her grandmother and then mentioned Paiute. Let me have a look at that. Judah held out a hand for the pendant, but Jonathan was reluctant to hand it over. Come on, Jonah. How can I be able to help you if I don't know what you're searching for or hiding, for that matter? I'm not hiding anything, Jonathan mumbled. It's a pendant, Abby said. Jonathan handed over this instant. If there's anyone who can help us know what it's all about, it's Judah. Give it to him now. Jonathan did so with a long face, and Judah studied the pendant for a brief moment. I think I've seen something like this somewhere. Where? Jonathan shot to his feet. Here in Woodland? Who is wearing it and where can we find them? Calm down, Jonah. Judah said with a brief laugh. I can't say for sure who it was, but this thing looks very familiar. We thank God for your great reading skills, Judah, the power of retention, and your good memory. Abby put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder once again and gently pressed downwards so he would sit. Jonathan Rusher, would you calm down and let Judah be? Hovering over him won't bring you the answer. Give the man time to think. Judah, please. Jonathan begged as if his life depended on it. Wait. Judah scratched his 5 o'clock shadow. Did the lady say Paiute? Yes. Why? Judah nodded. "Wait here." He handed the pendant back to his brother, then dashed up the stairs, returning a few minutes later with a pile of newspaper clippings. Here, he distributed them. "Search through them. I know we'll find something." After a few minutes of searching, Judah gave a triumphant shout. "Found it." He held up one of the clippings. He placed it on the table and motioned for Jonathan to put the pendant next to it. "I knew I had seen something like this before. Why I believe you found the answer to this mystery, or at least part of it." Abby bent down to read the article, but it was the blurry picture that interested her more. And it was a woman with one of those ageless faces, and she was wearing a pendant similar to the one on the table. The photo wasn't very clear, but Abby was sure it was one and the same pendant. This picture was taken 2 years ago, after a measles outbreak on the reservation, about 10 miles from here beyond the hills. The article says the clan lost so many of its people, and the remnant decided to move away and find other Paiute, probably to repopulate and preserve their heritage. Judah looked at Abby, then Jonathan. "Did the young lady tell you how she got this pendant?" Items like these are very precious and only handed down from parents to children. The young lady's name is Sophia Tenderfoot, so she's clearly one of them, but we have no idea how she got separated from her family. Abby, Sophia may be Indian, but she also has white blood. She's of mixed race, and it's my guess that she wasn't brought up around here. You're right, Jonathan. Judah, does the article say where Sophia's family moved to? No. It only says they went out of state, and it could have been in any direction. Remember, that was 2 years ago, and they might have moved around plenty of times since. After facing tragedies, Indians often search for their own kind so they can continue their lineage. Otherwise, they would soon be extinct. Judah was glad to share his knowledge. For the first time, members of his family were listening to him and actually paying attention to his words. And from what I know about the Paiute, they moved around a lot in the past. Unstable and hostile living situations would make them keep moving, and that is probably what happened to Sophia's family. How do we find them, Judah? Jonah, my dear brother, I wish I could give you the answers you desire. But with this newspaper clipping and the pendant, at least we have something to go on. We'll start the search tomorrow as soon as it's day. Today is too far gone, and no one will be willing to give answers in the darkness. Chapter 7. In Search of Family. Even with the limited information that he had, Jonathan refused to give up hope regarding Sophia's grandmother and her people. A whole tribe of people couldn't just disappear off the face of the earth, at least not in recent years. The Indian Wars had practically ceased as previously hostile tribes learned to live with the foreigners who came to their lands, or else made way when they didn't want to. For the next 2 days, Jonathan kept hoping Sophia would wake up and tell them something more, but she remained unconscious. Just as promised, Judah had helped him go around the town asking questions, but no one had any answers, though a few remembered the Indian tribe that had lived on the reservation. They had mostly kept to themselves, and since they bothered no one, people didn't even notice that they were there. "It's funny," Jonathan commented to his brother as they were returning home after yet another unfruitful search. "What is? That a whole tribe lived among us, and yet we barely acknowledged their existence. I would meet 1 or 2 of them in the forest, but they never bothered me, and so I also left them alone. That's just human nature, Jonah. When you don't have any reason to interact with a person, you don't bother about them much. That's why the little tribe could go unnoticed in our midst. But a few of them might have come out to town for some shopping or trading. They might, but they probably prefer to go to Greenacres, which is closer than our town. Then we should go to Greenacres and find out if anyone there knows of them or their present whereabouts. Tomorrow, Judah promised. We need to go home and find out if Sophia has regained consciousness and if she's said anything more. I wish she would wake up and tell us more, for then we might know where to search. When they got home, they found the doctor's buggy standing in the driveway in front of the house. Concerned that Sophia didn't seem to be getting better as they had expected, Jed informed them that he had brought in Dr. Drake, the new physician in Woodland, to check up on her. This was at Abby's urging, and Jonathan was impatient to know what he thought about the whole situation. Philip Drake was in his early 30s and had moved here from Chicago with his family. He shared all this information as he was taking a cup of tea after attending to the patient. Jonathan wished he would hurry up and say something about Sophia and caught Jed's sharp eye just when he was about to ask the doctor some questions. Philip was soon done with the tea and turned to Jed. "The young lady will be fine," he said. "I examined her and found that, apart from fatigue and malnourishment, she is all right." He put away the stethoscope that had been hanging around his neck and stood up, holding his bag. "You've all done a good job and I can't do much else. The wound is healing nicely, and whoever thought of cauterizing it probably saved her life. Else she would have bled to death since an artery was nicked. Just make sure she gets plenty of water and soup if she can keep it down. The fever is just the body's way of reacting to an injury, but all is well. She is young, strong, and healthy, and her body is fighting for her." After the doctor had left, the family convened in the living room. Jed was heading the meeting as usual. "Don't look so worried. Sophia will be all right. You heard the doctor say so." "I just feel so helpless, not knowing how to help her find her family. Judah and I must have asked hundreds of people, but no one knows anything about the tribe that lived on the reservation. It's as if they didn't ever exist, and I feel so ashamed of myself for not trying to befriend any of them. One has to be invited to be another's friend. I used to meet one or two of them, but apart from a casual perfunctory greeting, we shared nothing more," Jed said. "The tribe kept to themselves, and we pretty much left them alone, since they didn't bother us at all. Don't beat yourself up so much. If they had traded with us, we might have known them." Judah said that they probably went to Greenacres for all their supplies and were planning on going there tomorrow, just to find out. Jonathan sighed. "I was hoping Sophia would wake up and tell us a little bit more about herself so we can trace her family for her. We now know that her grandmother is Paiute and has a pendant, like the one she gave Abby. Why don't you go and ask Chief Braveheart on the Navajo reservation just out of town? You just said he's Najavo, a totally different tribe, Jed." "True. But he might have heard something about Sophia's tribe. Besides that, they often intermarry, and maybe someone on the Navajo reservation might know something that can help us find these people." "Thanks, Jed. I'll do that first thing in the morning." "I'll come with you," Judah said. "And if we don't find any helpful information, we'll then head over to Greenacres." Jonathan wasn't able to sleep and spent the night downstairs on the couch so he wouldn't disturb Sophia with his pacing. Why had this woman just invaded his life and heart and refused to leave? Who fell in love with an unconscious woman? Was he going crazy or something? Since he couldn't sleep, he was out of the house as soon as he heard the barn door opening. He knew that one of the workers was going in there to milk the cows and wanted to help him. "You're up early." Barnabas Kittle, or Barney, as everyone called him, was just getting ready to milk the first cow. "I'm surprised to see you around here. You like hiding in the forest, so I hope there's no trouble." "No." I just thought I should help you as I wait for Judah to wake up. He and I are supposed to go somewhere together. Is it about the young lady you found a few days ago? Yes, Barney. We're searching for her family, but they seem to have disappeared into thin air. We're going over to the Navajo reservation to speak with the chief and ask him if he's seen or heard anything. Chief Braveheart is a very suspicious man, and I would advise you to carry gifts. The man doesn't take too kindly to strangers, and if you want an audience with him, be sure to take him something like blankets or what? Don't dare carry blankets for him. He has never forgotten how many of his kind were killed by smallpox because of the blankets they were given as gifts. It might have been decades ago, and he probably wasn't even born then, but he remembers. Try something like corn flour, sugar, and maybe candy for the children. But don't be surprised if he insists on a meal being prepared out of the items you've taken and you are sharing it. Whatever it is, eat it, and then he'll open up to you. Are all Indians like that? Sadly, yes. Remember the ones who lived on the reservation on the other side of the forest? We barely even knew them. The terrible things they've been through have made them very suspicious of any gestures of friendship. You seem to know a lot about them. Barney shrugged. Sometimes it pays to know what is going on around you, Jonah. I wish you all the best in your search. Thank you, Barney. Chief Braveheart listened to Jonathan and Judah and stared at the pendant they'd given him as well as the newspaper clipping. Just as Barney had advised, they'd carried corn flour and candy as gifts and had shared a meal of thick porridge, wild vegetables, and roast deer with the man's family. He was in a very cordial mood, and Jonathan thanked God that he'd spoken with Barney. Paiute for sure. The chief pointed at the pendant. But none of them settled among us. Only a small number were left after the epidemic, and they thought it wise to find their own tribesmen so they could build up their population again. The number when they passed through here on their way up north was about 200 or so men and women and 100 little ones. That was 2 years ago, and they might have grown since. Much as we wanted to help them, we had to take care of our own and didn't interact much with them. Measles is a deadly disease, and a single infection would have also wiped us out. Did they mention anything about their destination? Chief Black Bear told me he was taking his people up north to find more Paiute. Probably as far as Canada. I suggested Nevada, but he said that was where the tribe had come from many years ago, and they didn't want to go back there. The Indian chief sighed. It was 2 years ago, and that's a while back. They are probably in Canada by now. Why do you seek them? A friend of ours is ill and searching for her family. Did something happen to separate her from them? Jonathan shook his head. In as far as we know, she's never met any of them, but she was the one who had this pendant. That's strange, but sorry I couldn't help much. As I said, they probably went up to Canada. Why would they choose to go so far up north? This from Judah. Because decades ago, when more palefaces came west and drove my people out, vast numbers moved north, and I'm sure the Paiute were among them. This group you seek could have gone in search of the rest of the tribe or part of it. After leaving the Navajo reservation, Jonathan turned to his brother. You need to go back home. I'm going north to see if I can find anyone who will tell me anything. I want to come with you. I know that and would have loved to have your company, but we have to consider those we left at home. They are waiting for news from us, and especially Sophia, if she's awake. Return and tell them what Chief Braveheart said, and let them know where I'm headed. As soon as I get to a town with a post office, I'll send a telegram to let you all know what's going on. Very well then. Judah squinted at him and wagged a finger in his face, but just know that I'm returning home under a lot of protest. Oh, Judah, I really wish you could come with me. Just go and find Sophia's family so you can all be happy. And what's that supposed to mean? Jonah. Jonah, my dear brother, why else would a man go out of his way to solve a mystery that has no beginning? It's clear that you're in love with this lady and want to make her happy. So I wish you Godspeed and all the best. Chapter 8. Going Further North. Though Jonathan tried to focus on the difficult journey ahead of him, Sophia filled his thoughts, and he wondered what she would think when she woke up. Much as he knew that she would be well taken care of, he had hated leaving her as he went in search of her family. She'd looked so small and frail lying in the large bed, and more than ever, he wanted to find her grandmother. It was just a few days since she'd come into his life, but she'd managed to penetrate the thick walls he'd erected around his heart. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt that his heart had been moved by a woman. For 25 years, he'd shut out thoughts of finding someone to love and to love him back. Seeing his 3 older brothers falling in love with their beautiful wives had made him all the more lonely. When she woke up, would Sophia even remember him? And if she did, would she think of him as a prospective husband, or would he merely be the man who saved her life and maybe found her family? Was he wasting his time and thoughts on her? Apart from being very beautiful, he thought she was very courageous, and he found himself wondering where she'd come from. It was obvious that she was new in Woodland, else why would she have been on private property? Clearly, she'd been living in his shed and feeding from his house and traps for days. How long had she lived out in the forest before she found refuge in his home? Everyone in Woodland knew that the Rusher farm wasn't particularly welcoming to strangers who had no business being there. Their land was quite remote, and no one ever strayed out that way unless they had business with one of the brothers or they were hopelessly lost. Sighing as he waited for the train that would take him up to the border with Oregon, Jonathan didn't understand why he was feeling this way about a woman who'd barely spoken a sentence to him. In the days he'd been taking care of her, he'd sat and slept on the chair at her bedside and kept telling himself that he was doing it for Abby. His sister-in-law had so much to do, and having just delivered her second baby, barely 2 months ago, she needed all the help she could get. Having an invalid in the house and 2 small children, plus her husband and his brothers, was quite a load to carry. Sophia had woken up a few times, looked at him, and then slumped back into unconsciousness again. He'd never seen anyone with such expressive deep violet eyes, and each time he'd felt as if she was telling him something. Would she remember all that when she woke up? Without understanding how it had happened, Jonathan found himself feeling uncharacteristically protective towards Sophia. He wanted to make her world all right, make her smile. Then a disturbing thought entered his mind. What if she belonged to someone else, who was probably searching for her? Could he bear to lose her to someone even if she belonged to them first? His brothers Joshua and John had found their wives in very strange ways, and he seemed headed in the same direction. Joshua had won Beth's heart from another man. Even so, there had been a lot of tension when the rightful fiancé had showed up at the Rusher farm to claim his bride. Joshua Rafford hadn't come alone, but brought friends, and they had threatened to burn the house down and rescue Beth, for they thought Joshua had kidnapped her. Luckily, it was Beth herself who saved the day by declaring that she was in love with Joshua Rusher and not Joshua Rafford, her original fiancé. John's story was not so different either, except there wasn't an enraged fiancé claiming her, but an irate father. Catherine Langer had slipped and fallen into their wagon, and they rode home without being aware of her presence. Her father had declared her kidnapped, and John got thrown into jail when he attempted to explain why she was at their farm. Too angry to listen to reason, Fred Langer had insisted that John should be hanged, but once again, his brother was saved by the woman he had fallen in love with. The last thing the Rushers needed on the farm was another man or family showing up and claiming that their daughter had been kidnapped. Deputy Gaines would have a fit, and after the last time there had been trouble on the farm, he'd threatened to toss all of them in jail. The sooner Jonathan found Sophia's family and let her go, the better for everyone, especially if she belonged to someone else. The thought made him really sad, but he had to do the right thing, even though it would break his heart to lose the woman he had fallen in love with. The train arrived and he sat in the near-empty third-class coach. One of the porters, a Negro man, came over and introduced himself. "The name is Samuel Newman. Where are you headed?" "Jonathan Rusher from Woodland. I'm headed toward Oregon to find family. Have you been on this route long?" "Every few days. I travel up to Seattle, then back to Los Angeles." "Done this same route for the past 5 years. Why do you ask?" "Would you know of any Indian reservations along the route or in any of the towns along the railroad up to Oregon?" It was a long shot, but Jonathan was desperate. Any little information would help. "Why, yes. Between Woodland and Oregon are 3 reservations, though they are far apart. I know this for a fact because I've conveyed a few Indians there from time to time, and sometimes supplies for the general stores and mail too. Which particular tribe do you seek?" "The Paiute." "They moved from Woodland about 2 years ago. Cuxhaven is one of the tiniest towns in Northern California, and there's a small tribe there. Not sure if they are the people you seek, but since they are the first before you get to the border, you could try and ask them. If not, just hop on to the next train and continue with your journey." Know that closer to the border are the Shoshone. Very friendly people those, and they tip very well whenever we deliver supplies to them. And that was what Jonathan did. When the train got to Cuxhaven, he bid Samuel farewell after thanking him for his assistance and gave him $5. The town, just like Samuel had said, was really tiny. The rail track ran right through the center of the town, and there was a building on each side of it, though at a safe distance. There was a small church on the side he alighted from, and when he looked across the track, saw a general store and beside it a blacksmith's yard. The store was open, and he crossed the tracks. It was well past noon when Jonathan stepped off the train, and from the lack of anyone else alighting at the minor halt, it was obvious that this wasn't a regular stopping point for the train. 3 little boys of between 3 and 6 years old were running around and kicking something that looked like the distended head of a goat, and he smiled. Little boys everywhere reminded him of his boisterous 2.5-year-old nephew, Jed and Abby's son. Jacob was a delight, and whenever Jonathan was free, he found himself seeking the child out. The little boy never asked questions that he couldn't answer, and he made for good company. He also seemed to like Jonathan, though he himself couldn't understand why. A few days back, Jonathan had made him a ball from the bladder of the bear he'd killed by stuffing it with sawdust. Of course, Abby had been horrified the first time she saw it, but when she realized that it was making her son happy, soon gave her consent for him to play with it. But it didn't last the day because Lucy, their hound, smelled it, took a huge bite, and then emptied it of the sawdust and gobbled it up. Jacob was inconsolable for some hours until Jonathan made him another ball, but this time using the skin of a deer. Lucy tried to take a bite once again, but it was too tough for her, and she gave up and lost interest. The children were so immersed in their game that they didn't spare him even a passing glance, and he walked past them and found himself standing outside the store. He could see 2 people inside, a man and woman. They were staring at him, and he took his hat off and stepped into the store. It was no different from the outside, for the heat was intense, which was surprising for this time of the year. He could feel the sweat running down his back, but he wasn't nervous. The man and woman looked friendly enough. "Good afternoon, Sir. "Good afternoon to you, young man. You're new in these parts." The man stated the obvious. "Yes, sir. I just got off the train a few minutes ago." "Are you perhaps looking for a place to board for a day or two? We have 2 rooms at the back of the store, and these are currently empty. We usually let visitors stay for a night or two. Nothing permanent." "Thank you for the offer, but I'm here to find my family. Here in Cook's Haven. I believe I know everyone here." "What is the family name?" Jonathan didn't know what the man thought about Indians, but he was here, so he had to do what he could. They are an Indian tribe and moved up here from Woodland about 2 years ago. This is a small town, and the population is barely 500 souls. Even then, they are scattered all over the valley. The only people who are bunched up are Indians who moved up here about 2 years ago. But you don't look like them at all, so how can you say that they are your family?" "Not mine, sir, but my wife's. Tenderfoot is the surname. Have you heard any of them called by that name?" "No, because these people only visit the store for supplies, but pretty much keep to themselves." "Have you been searching for long?" "Yes, sir." "Well, they live about 2 miles from here. I would take you there, but as you can see, we're a little bit busy." He pointed at his wife, who was measuring out corn flour. "Yesterday, a new batch of flour and sugar came in, and we have to put this in packs for our customers to collect later when they come for the evening service. It's the only time many of them come into town, seeing as they live quite a distance away. You see, I'm also the sheriff, the pastor, the store owner, blacksmith, and sometimes the doctor too. If you walk down this road, you'll get to a crossroads running in all 4 directions. Take the turn to your left, and after a few yards, you'll get to your destination." "Thank you very much, sir." Jonathan turned to leave. "Wait!" the man called out. "Pardon my deplorable manners. The name is Luke Oatley, and this is Rhoda, who is my wife. Those noisy brats out there belong to us. They're Rufus, Mark, and Leonard. What's your name?" "Jonathan Rusher from Woodland." "Would you kindly take this sugar and corn flour to White Eagle for me, please?" She placed an order which I would normally deliver, but seeing as you're headed their way, would you do me the favor? It will also be a way of making them regard you as a friend." "Yes, I will do so." For the second time that same day, Jonathan was having to go visiting while bearing gifts. But to be fair, these weren't from him, but an order placed by someone named White Eagle. He hoped they would receive him and give him the information he sought. Apart from a satchel bag, Jonathan didn't have any other luggage and easily carried the 2 small burlap sacks on one shoulder. Just as Luke had said, the small reservation was 2 miles from the town. It was nestled in a small valley, and there were trees all around. The moment he got close, he felt that his movements were being observed. At first, he didn't see any human beings, but he could see some cows and goats grazing a short distance away. "Friend or foe?" a voice called out when he stepped into the small copse. Jonathan was tempted to call out, "Foe," just to see what would happen, but this wasn't the time for jokes. The last thing he wanted was to find himself being scalped when he had so much to live for. Sophia was waiting back in Woodland, and he wanted to return to her, and whatever the case and her situation, he would convince her that he was the right man, the only man for her. "Friend," he said instead, "I come in peace. He stopped and waited to be invited further. A man of about 70 stepped out from behind one of the trees, and Jonathan was surprised that he hadn't noticed him before, for he wore very colorful regalia. He had on a shiny black bearskin shoulder cape, and his headgear was made of bright feathers, all held together by an intricately woven band made of colorful beads. It was really beautiful, and Jonathan knew that he had come face to face with the chief of this particular tribe. Had he come with Judah, his brother might have identified which particular tribe it was. "Where do you come from?" From Woodland. He lowered the sacks to the ground. "Mr. Oatley at the store asked me to bring this sugar and flour to White Eagle. Luke is a lazy man, but has a good heart." The chief smiled, and Jonathan saw that his teeth were milky white. "So you're now running his errands for him?" "Not really, but since I was headed this way, he asked me to make this delivery for him." Jonathan wasn't surprised that the man spoke good English, though with a faint accent. Most of the Indians he'd met in recent years were educated and spoke good English. Living among the whites had made them learn the language so they could easily trade and conduct other business with them. "You are welcome." The chief motioned to two young men who also appeared out of nowhere to take the sacks away. "Come and sit." He led the way to a large teepee and entered in. "The sun is very hot outside, and you look like you could do with a drink." Jonathan followed him inside and was surprised that the interior of the temporary living structure was so cool. The paintings and hangings on the wall took his breath away. He'd never been inside any Indian habitation and was quite impressed. "What brings you to our land, red-headed stranger?" "I seek the family of a friend of mine." He took the pendant and newspaper clipping from the bag. "This is the woman that I seek for. She's my friend's grandmother, and this belongs to my friend. I see that this woman in the picture has a similar one." The chief seemed to be studying the two items, but Jonathan had the feeling that he wasn't seeing any of them. "Long ago," the chief was half whispering, "the old Sherman foretold of a red-headed pale face who would come seeking for family. The wise one said this man would be a very significant part of us, but many moons passed, and we soon forgot." He turned his eyes back on Jonathan. "What is the name of your friend?" "Sophia Tenderfoot." And he told the chief how he'd found her lying on the path and carried her home. "My sister-in-law is taking care of her as I search for her family. Would you know this woman?" The chief's response was to raise his voice, and he spoke in a melodious dialect. A woman seemed to appear out of nowhere, and her direct gaze discomfited Jonathan, for her deep violet eyes reminded him of someone. Then he exclaimed and looked at the newspaper clipping. She was the woman in the picture. Of that he was sure. Chapter 9. Family at last. Sophia woke up feeling restless, but much better, and managed to sit up on her own. She was alone in the bedroom and wondered how long she'd been here. It seemed like ages. The door opened, and the same petite woman, with kind eyes and ready smile she'd seen on her first day here, entered the room. She tried to remember her name, and then it came to her. Abby. "Welcome back to us, my dear. I hope you remember that my name is Abby or Abigail, whichever you prefer." "Yes, I remember. Thank you for being so kind and caring for me." Sophia's hand automatically went to her neck, and she cried out in alarm. "My pendant is safe?" Abby quickly sat on the bed and stilled her hand. "You woke up briefly a few days ago and gave it to me. You also mentioned that you were searching for your grandmother and also said the word Paiute. Where is my pendant?" She was relieved, but she wanted to touch it and feel like she wasn't in a dream. "Jonathan took it with him and went in search of your family. He's been gone for 2 days now, and my husband has gone to town to see if he sent us a telegram to update us on any progress he's made so far." Sudden fatigue assailed Sophia, and she found herself stifling a yawn. Coming to California to find her grandmother had seemed like such an adventure at first, but now all she felt was hopelessness. What if she never found White Eagle? What would she do? She couldn't very well continue imposing on the kindness of Abby and her family, and returning home after failing in what she had set out to do wasn't an option either. Don't look so downcast, Sophia. If your grandmother is out there, Jonathan will find her and your people. Thank you for the reassurance and for being so kind. But I have to start thinking that maybe this whole journey was a waste. I have to start facing the reality that things might not go as I wish them to. What if I never find my grandmother? She sniffed. Sophia, have faith. If I know my brother-in-law, he won't stop searching until he finds them. Take heart, Abby stood up. You haven't eaten proper food for days. And I know you must be hungry. But first you need to freshen up also, and then if you're feeling up to it, you could come down to the living room and properly meet the family. You're very nice people, and I thank you for taking me in even though you didn't have to. We like having you here with us. I was just getting the bathroom ready so you can wash up. You must be feeling all grimy. The bath somewhat refreshed and cheered Sophia up, but she felt like she was missing something. It came to her when she was back in the bedroom and dressed in one of Abby's dresses, which was a bit tight given that Abby was a slight woman. She knew that she was being foolish, but she missed the gentle voice that she'd heard as if in her dreams. From time to time, as she'd hovered between consciousness and darkness, she'd felt the rough, calloused hands stroking her brow, touching her face, and even wiping her tears away at one point. At the time, she had felt loved and protected, and in her brief moments of consciousness, she'd seen the red-haired man seated by her bedside. He always seemed to be there when she opened her eyes, and the tender look in his was one of the reasons she'd struggled to return. But he wasn't here now, and she found herself longing to see him again. It was amazing that he'd showed her kindness, even after she'd stolen from his traps, entered his house and helped herself to whatever food was there, and also slept in his shed. But she'd been so desperate and hungry. It was her own fault that she'd gotten hurt, and had he not been close by, she would have died. She would have died. She owed the red-haired man her life and wished he was here so she could tell him that. A sound outside made her hop on one leg to the window, but it wasn't who she sought. There were 3 men out in the front yard, but all were dark-haired. She recognized one of them as the one who'd been at the cabin with the red-haired man. Abby had called him Jonathan, and she found herself whispering his name over and over again. Moving to the chair that was near the window, she sank into it and let her emotions wash over her. Why was she feeling like she had lost something? Abby had asked her to join the family downstairs for a proper introduction, but she really didn't feel up to it. She just wanted to sit here and continue feeling sorry for herself, but her wish wasn't granted. Hearing footsteps coming down the hallway, she quickly sat up and wiped her face. "You look really troubled, Sophia." Abby entered the room carrying a tray. The aroma tantalized Sophia's nostrils, and she realized that she was really hungry. "I brought you some chicken soup, and Beth sent over some of her delicious bread. You need your strength, and I hope you'll enjoy this simple meal." "I must admit, I'm rather hungry." "Good." Abby placed the tray on a small stool and carried it over to the window. "Are you still worried about your pendant?" No, and then to her consternation, she burst into tears. "There now, things can't be that bad. Jonathan will soon be back with good news, and you'll see your family again, Abby put a hand around her shoulders and rocked her gently from side to side. Have faith in God, because we've all been praying that Jonathan will look in the right place and find your family. Don't despair. I feel so silly. Sophia gave her hostess a watery smile. I don't cry easily. Around here, you're allowed to cry as much as you want. Seeing as you've been through a lot and you're feeling very emotional just now, it's a wonder that you aren't in a worse state. But all will be well, you'll see. Now, why don't you eat your soup, because my mama used to say that things always look better once the stomach is filled with food. That's what my mother also used to say. She picked up the spoon and tasted the soup. It was really good, and she found herself eating under Abby's watchful eye. The bread was delicious, but she could only manage a small slice. This food is really delicious, and I wish I could actually eat more of the bread. It's so delicious. Don't worry. There's plenty more, and when you need it, it will be there. Once you're stronger, you'll get to taste Beth's cooking. She's French, and I've been learning a thing or two about making pastries. Who is this Beth you keep mentioning? Sorry? Abby laughed. Forgive me for assuming that you know everyone. You haven't met the family yet, but they've all been to see you when you were unconscious. We're a large family. I hope my being here hasn't inconvenienced anyone. This room is lovely, and I'm sorry to have put the owner out. Don't worry about that at all. With the bunkhouse and workers' cabins, we have plenty of room for anyone who needs it. Now let me introduce you to the family in their absence, so when you meet them, you'll know who is who. My husband is the firstborn, and he's Jedediah, but we all call him Jed. We have 2 children, Jacob and Amy. Then Joshua comes next, and he's Beth's husband. John is 3rd, and he's married to Catherine, or Kate, as we now call her. Then in this order is your Jonathan, Judah, Josiah, and Jeremiah. That's the whole lot of us. Beth and Joshua have a beautiful little girl called Bibi. You said Beth is French. Yes. Yes. My father was half French, but I never knew him. I'm very sorry for your loss. Thank you. My grandmother's all I have left of him, and I pray that I find her. You will, Abby reiterated. Do you want me to help you back to bed? She stacked the dishes back onto the tray and pushed the stool aside. We don't want you overtiring yourself when you've just woken up. Do you need anything else? No, and thank you very much for that lovely meal. Please, let me sit here for a while and stretch my back. I've been lying in that bed for days now. Very well then, but I don't want you to feel like you have to get better too quickly. Take your time, and when you're ready, we'll deal with what comes next. Do you have any family who might be worried about you? No. Sophia turned to stare outside, and she wished she was strong enough to go outside and enjoy the sunshine. Back in Boston, it was probably really cold as fall approached, but out here the air was quite warm. She found herself thinking about Jonathan, the man who had rescued her and was now out there searching for her family, or what was left of it. She missed him and wished he was here. Then she berated herself for allowing her emotions to get the better of her. How had she fallen in love with a man she'd barely spoken to? She'd been unconscious most of the time, and even when she woke up, they'd not spoken to each other. But she kept hearing his voice in her mind. Did such things happen in real life? Did a person fall in love even while unconscious? She doubted it, and finally concluded that she was being rather foolish. Why would a handsome man like Jonathan Rusher be interested in her at all? He was out there trying to find her family out of a sense of obligation because it was one of his traps that had injured her. The man was probably not thinking about her in terms of romance, so she also needed to get a grip on herself. Our Jonathan is a good man, Abby was saying. He was so worried about you that he spent nearly every hour by your bedside. For Jonathan, that's quite something. Why? Because of all my brothers by marriage, he's the one I understand the least. Though he keeps us well supplied with meat from his hunting, he's a loner, and from time to time, I have to practically beg him to come back to the house. He moved out of this house a few weeks after I got here, and for a while, I thought it was my presence that had driven him away. But Jed told me that Jonathan has always kept to himself. Seeing him here at the house watching over you has made us really happy. Is that so? Yes. For the first time, he forgot all about his traps and guns and concentrated on another person. You made quite an impression on him, and Jed thinks Jonathan is in love with you. Love? Sophia found herself blushing furiously and covered her face with her hands. He also made quite an impression on you, I see. I barely know him. You may not know him in your waking moments, but your subconscious mind recognized a kindred spirit. There's something about these rusher men that I can't quite explain, and actually nobody can. I fell in love with my Jed within minutes of meeting him. Beth and Kate, who you'll get to meet soon, say the same thing about their own husbands. You don't have to spend many hours with the rushermen to find out that they are very special. Then Abby thought of something. Or are you already taken? The last thing we want is for some man to show up here breathing fire and calling down brimstones to rain on our heads. Sophia twisted her lips wryly. Who would have me? She asked in a whisper. What? Why would you ever think that no one would want you? I'm of mixed parentage and back in Boston. No man wanted me for a wife. To have a sinful relationship, yes, but not to be married to them and bear their children. Their pure blood shouldn't be mixed up with my Indian blood. Abby laughed loudly. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Out here in the West, no one cares about color or race unless they are demented. Here in Woodland, nobody cares what your skin color is as long as you're a decent human being. Abby's words filled Sophia's heart with warmth. Tell me more about this grandmother that you seek. She's Paiute and my father's mother. Papa's father, as I told you before, was French. He was an explorer but returned to France when his work here was done. His name was Eugene, but my mother never told me what the surname was. He and my grandmother were married in a traditional ceremony, and after he left, Grandma found out that she was pregnant. When she wrote and told him about the child she was expecting, he wanted her to go to him. But White Eagle refused to go to France and stayed here to have my father and be with her people. Mama traveled to Nevada where the tribe lived before. As a mail-order bride all the way from Boston. My father was Adam Tenderfoot, and he was a doctor. After he died, my mother went back to her people. That sounds so romantic. Sophia shook her head. My father died when Ma was pregnant with me, and she returned to her family. No romance there. When I was 4, she remarried, and I have 2 younger sisters, Pamela and Alice. Since she didn't want to make her family seem like they were terrible people, she didn't share with Abby about how her maternal grandparents had practically disowned her mother. This was after it was known that she'd been married to an Indian, or the stressful life she'd lived in her stepfather's home. Chapter 10. Family at Last. Lucy's loud barking woke everyone up, and Sophia was out of bed and quickly pulled on the dressing gown Kate had so thoughtfully sent over. These people had been very kind to her, and she'd met Kate and Beth just the previous evening. Being able to walk made her happy, but her legs still hurt. She moved to the window, which overlooked the front courtyard, and gasped. Turning too quickly, she winced and had to lean against the wall to catch her breath as the sharp pain reminded her of her injury. When the wave passed, she quickly dressed and hobbled out of the bedroom and down the stairs, meeting Abby, who was just emerging from her bedroom. "What's going on?" Josiah called out from the kitchen. "Indians, about 100 of them," Jeremiah said from the living room. He was peeping through the window as if he was scared to open the door, and Abby made a clicking sound at him. "Stop exaggerating." She turned to Sophia. "Don't mind Jeremiah. He likes to blow things out of proportion and embellish stories. Let's go out there and find out what's going on." The first person Sophia noticed when they all stepped onto the porch was the woman wearing the pendant that looked like hers. When she noticed Sophia staring at her, she smiled. "Grandma." Sophia didn't wait for a response, but hobbled down the steps and into the arms of her grandmother. Suddenly, she was surrounded by people who were reaching out to her with love, and in that moment, she knew that she had come home. There was so much love radiating from them. "Grandma." "My love? You're so beautiful and look so much like your father. You have my eyes," White Eagle said. "This is my brother, Black Bear, and the chief of our people, so he's your granduncle." Sophia was passed from hand to hand, hugged, rejoiced over, and she couldn't remember half the names that were whispered to her. But she was so happy meeting her various aunts, uncles, and cousins. "We're a big family in spite of what we've been through." "But we couldn't all come," White Eagle said when Sophia was back in her arms. "Your young man made quite an impression on my brother." And saying this, the elderly woman pulled a man over, one who had stood aloof before, and Sophia was surprised to see that it was the red-haired man who'd been occupying her thoughts from the moment she woke up. He was also dressed in traditional Indian regalia, and he was grinning at her. "Your husband is now an honorary member of the Council of our Elders," Sophia heard her grandmother saying. "My husband," she whispered, suddenly feeling shy. "Yes. After he found us, he sought permission from the chief to return and ask for your hand in marriage. We came along to offer support and also give you both our blessing." Her grandmother took both their hands and then handed them over to the chief. The elderly man wrapped both hands in a soft, pure white cotton cloth and chanted unintelligible words, but White Eagle softly translated them to English. "Now you will feel no rain, for each of you will be the shelter for each other. Now you will feel no cold, for each of you will be the warmth for the other. Now there is no more loneliness. Now you are two persons, but there is only one life before you. Go now to your dwelling place to enter into the days of your life together. And may your days be good and long upon the earth." "Amen." Everyone else said amen, and then a piercing cry broke out, and Sophia smiled when she saw her relatives leaping about like little children, singing in their language. It was so beautiful and brought tears to her eyes. For so long, she had thought that no one would want her for a wife, yet Jonathan Rusher hadn't protested when her grandmother called him her husband. He'd actually asked for their permission so he could ask for her hand in marriage. Jonathan felt Sophia's hand trembling in his, and he looked down at her. "Yes," she whispered hoarsely, not wanting to let go of his hand. This felt so good, so right. "You look like one of my people, and I barely recognized you. Even your own family is still dazed at how you look." She pointed at the men and women who were staring at what was going on in wonder. It was clear that they'd never been this close to Indians before, but from their smiles, Sophia knew that there would be no trouble. "I don't want you to overstrain yourself," Jonathan told her. "Would like to sit down for a moment." He looked at his new family, a broad smile on his face. He'd found them for Sophia, and not only that, they seemed happy that he had asked them for permission to marry her even though none had ever set eyes on her. It was a sign of respect, as White Eagle had told him, that showed that he honored his wife by showing much regard for her family. "They are so happy, and I know they don't intend to stop all their dancing anytime soon. Thank you so much for finding my grandmother for me. I don't know what to say." "You could start by saying that you love me as much as I love you," he whispered, and she blushed even more. "I love you so much, but it feels like I'm crazy." "Why?" "This is the first time we're actually speaking to each other." He scooped her up into his arms and she gave a little squeal. "You need to get off that leg so it can heal properly." He carried her up to the porch and sat down with her on his lap. "Now, shall we speak some more about our lives? This feels like a dream. Is it really possible to fall in love with a person when you're unconscious? I don't know, but when I brought you here and watched you for a few days, I knew that there wasn't anyone else I wanted to be with for the rest of my life." Then he became serious. "I don't want to presume that you have accepted me." "Why wouldn't I accept you, Jonathan? You've been so good to me. I don't want you to feel obligated to me just because I saved your life and also found your family." Sophia frowned slightly, wondering what Jonathan was talking about. Of course, she was grateful that he had found her grandmother, and she now had a large family who were so happy to see her. "What do you want me to say, Jonathan?" He sighed. "It doesn't matter," and placing her on the seat, stood up. "I need to change out of these clothes and then see Jed so I can make arrangements for a place to sleep for our guests. Though I think they might dance the whole afternoon and night away, we also have to feed them." He walked away and entered the house, leaving her feeling like she'd done something wrong. When he emerged dressed in what she was sure was another brother's clothes, since they didn't fit very well, her eyes followed him everywhere. He walked to Jed, and she was so intent on watching him that she didn't see White Eagle coming up the porch steps until she was standing right beside her. "That's a fine young man, quite troubled in spirit, but a good man nonetheless. I don't understand him at all, Grandma. It's as though he wants something from me, but I have no idea what it is. Men can be a little difficult to understand, and it takes a lot of patience to get to know what to do to make them happy. But you also have to consider yourself and how you really feel about him. Do you love Jonathan?" "Yes, Grandma, I do," she said unhesitatingly. "Then there's nothing to fear. All will be well. Love has a way of making things work out just right. Do you hear me, child?" Sophia nodded and turned to her grandmother. "Grandma, why did you never look for me all these years? I would have loved to know you as I was growing up." White Eagle placed a firm but gentle hand on Sophia's arm. "A lot of things happened after your father died. Your mother and I were both grieving, and much as I would have loved to have her and you close, circumstances weren't favorable. Mama told me about the one-eyed hawk." White Eagle chuckled. "That was the only way I could get her to return to her people. One-eyed hawk wasn't at all interested in Deborah. He already had 2 wives and wasn't looking for a third." She sighed. "It's just sad that he died a few years ago, or he would be here howling with laughter after hearing that I had used his name to get your mother to leave the tribe. He was a good man. But why make Mama feel like she would be the cause of trouble if she stayed? Because she might have died having you, and I didn't want that to happen. Those years weren't like today when doctors are easily available. We lived in a remote part of Nevada, and that's why when the measles attacked, we lost so many. The roads were really bad, and the railroad hadn't been laid up to the place we were. Your mother loved your father so much, and losing him made her nearly give up. If it wasn't for the fact that she was carrying you, she might have given up altogether. I didn't know that. Boston was more advanced, and they had good hospitals, and I wanted you to live. Sending Darrow away was the hardest thing I ever had to do, but it had to be done. My prayer was that my son's child would find me one day. But you should have at least gotten in touch with Mama. I thought of it many times, but your mother was young and needed to find someone to love her again. Had I kept in touch, she would never have moved on and might have allowed guilt to keep her from happiness. But she wasn't happy. What do you mean, child? Mama married Mr. George Kincaid, and his mother is something else. They never accepted me, and I was treated like an outsider. If you had reached out then, I would have come to live with you. White Eagle shook her head. Sophia, have you stopped for one moment to think that you might also have been at fault? What? It's normal for someone who feels that they are different to put up walls to protect themselves. When your mother got married to your stepfather, did he immediately start treating you like an outsider? Sophia thought about her grandmother's question and then realized that she had started feeling like a stranger in her own home when she became a teenager. From your silence, I gather that this didn't happen immediately. Things were all fine until I turned about 13 or so. Sophia frowned. Her stepfather had loved her now that she thought about it. He would carry her on his shoulder, and whenever he traveled, had always brought back presents for her and her sisters. What had gone wrong? Suddenly, Mr. Kincaid became all cold and aloof, and when I turned 16, when Mama told me that he wasn't my real father. Was that when you changed your name? Yes, Grandma. I didn't think he wanted me to continue using his name. Sophia, White Eagle took both her hands, forcing her to turn so they were facing each other. If Mr. Kincaid hadn't wanted you to use his name, he would have made it clear right from the beginning. But for 12 years, he allowed you to use his name, and I think he is a good man, but something must have happened to cause him to become distant. His mother, no doubt. Whatever she is still your grandmother. Sophia, White Eagle's voice softened, but her words hit home. We may never know why your stepfather suddenly changed, but I can say for a fact that your own attitude didn't help matters. Maybe Deborah also contributed to this. I know that she loved Adam so much and would want to protect his child, but that could have been taken the wrong way by Mr. Kincaid. He might have felt that she was favoring you over his children, and that could have caused a problem to arise. I never thought of it like that. Sophia felt like crying. She'd always thought that her stepfather and grandmother didn't like her, but what if she had unknowingly put up walls so they couldn't get in? Please don't think that I'm scolding you or anything, but in my many years of life, I have come to discover that it never pays to hold a grudge against anyone, not even for a single moment. That will only create pain and bitterness in your heart, and you lose so much by being estranged from people who you ought to be close with. Oh, Grandma, Sophia fell into the old woman's arms and wept. She loved George Kincaid and for so long had never thought of him as anything other than her father, and she missed the closeness she'd shared with Pamela and Alice. What if she was the one who had driven a wedge between them? Nana Barbie might have been prejudiced, But what if she'd taken that to heart and created a chasm to separate them further? Chapter 11. Mending Fences. The dancing went on for a while and then suddenly stopped, and Jonathan wondered why. Then he saw a group of men riding into the homestead, led by Deputy Gaines and Dale, their neighbor, who lived down the road. Jonathan and Jed had slaughtered 2 bulls for the celebrations, and he'd stayed away from Sophia on purpose so he could sort his thoughts out. Abby and Beth were baking biscuits and bread to feed everyone, and he wished he could feel as happy as he had before when Chief Black Bear joined him and Sophia. Was that part of a wedding ceremony, or had it merely been a blessing for their future? "Jed," Judah called out, "Deputy Gaines wants to see you." "Sure." Jed stood up and motioned to Jonathan to take his place roasting the meat. The aroma filled the air and his stomach rumbled. He started tasting tidbits because he hadn't had a proper meal since he left home 3 days ago. White Eagle had provided food, but he was too excited to do much justice to it, especially when she told him that she would accompany him so she could meet her granddaughter. "For a man who just got married, you look so glum." Judah came and stood by his side. "What's wrong with you, Jonah?" "What am I doing?" he half asked himself. "Gaining a wife is what you're doing. Or don't you want Sophia anymore?" "I do, but I'm not sure she wants me." "Look at the way her eyes follow you everywhere," Judah said. "This woman loves you and you love her, else you wouldn't have gone to all that trouble to find her family. What if all she feels for me is gratitude, which will soon wear off?" "I can't stop you from thinking such dismal thoughts, but I can tell you this. Sophia is a good woman, and if she wasn't ready to be your wife, she wouldn't have allowed the chief to pronounce such a profound blessing over both of you. Don't drive the girl away because of your doubts. Give her the chance to prove that she loves you and that this marriage can work." "Judah, I just feel so strange." "Why is that?" "You could say that this is the first day that Sophia and I have spoken to each other. How do I know that I'm not just being foolish? Beth and Joshua met the same day, and she wasn't even his fiancée. But they got married and see how happy they are. Same case with Abby and Jed, then John and Kate. We rushers are probably destined to find love in strange ways, and there's nothing wrong with that. Besides, White Eagle looks like a very wise woman, and if she didn't think you were good enough for her granddaughter, she wouldn't have allowed all this to go on." "That's true," Jonathan smiled for the first time. "What do you think Deputy Gaines wanted?" "I don't know, but here he is now. Why don't you ask him?" Jonathan turned to find the deputy sheriff and Jed walking back to them. "Congratulations, dear boy. Though like all Rusher stories, this one also sounds really odd. Are you sure you didn't abduct the poor girl and force her family here?" Jonathan heard the teasing tone and smiled. "I wish you all the best in your future." "I hope there's no problem, Deputy." "No, my dear boy. Dale down the road heard all the caterwauling and thought you'd been attacked by Indians. The man is so dramatic, and when he showed up at the station, we rushed out so fast. Now it turns out that this is an Indian wedding festival." He shook his head and chuckled softly. "Once again, may you have a wonderful life together with your little lady." "Thank you." Jonathan passed the skewer to Jed. "I need to see Sophia." Sophia silently watched as Jonathan returned and sat down next to her. He had a plate of roasted meat in his hand. Her grandmother had gone to help Abby and Beth. "Sophia, please forgive me for being such a fool." He picked a small piece and fed it to her, causing her to blush as she noticed people staring at them. Jonathan didn't seem to care and continued feeding her. "No, Jonathan, I'm the one who should ask you for forgiveness," she said in between bites. The meat was so tender, and the fact that Jonathan was feeding her made her feel so special. You haven't done anything wrong, but I walked away from you. Grandma told me that I need to learn how to listen to your heart and not just your words, she said softly, drawing closer to him. My grandmother feels that you have deep fear within you, and as your bride, I should help you deal with it. Jonathan gave a start. That woman is shrewd. Very true, and I feel so refreshed after speaking with her. My heart is now at peace, and I want to ask you a favor. Anything, my darling. Sophia hesitated, not knowing how Jonathan would react to her request. There are so many things you don't know about me. When I left home, I wasn't on good terms with my stepfather and my sisters, and Mama always got caught in between. I'd like to write and ask for their forgiveness, and also to invite Mama to come for our wedding. This one? Aren't they already too late for it? She shook her head. I'd like us to be wed in church, even though this is good enough for me. Receiving God's blessings over our union in the presence of my mother will make me so happy. If that's all, then why don't we write to her today and invite her to come? I saw the sheriff and other people coming in. What did they want? Jonathan chuckled. Our neighbor down the road heard the joyous cries and supposed that we were being attacked by Indians, so he rode to town to get the sheriff. Jed cleared the air, and as you can see, everyone is now having a wonderful time. We invited them to join in the celebration. Chapter 12. Joyous Reconciliation. If she smiled any harder, her face would split into two. Sophia was so happy that it was her wedding day. But what excited her more was the telegram she'd received just that morning. Her mother would be arriving shortly, and she couldn't wait to see her. With Jonathan's help, she'd written to her mother, stepfather, grandmother, and sisters to ask for their forgiveness. She'd done separate letters for each, but it was only her mother that she asked to come for her wedding. Somehow, she didn't think her stepfather and the rest would want to have anything to do with her. Goodness knows that she hadn't made things easy for them before, but she prayed that they would forgive her. Still, her heart was at peace, and she'd taken the first step towards reconciliation. Maybe one day in the future, she would travel to Boston with Jonathan and visit her whole family. I'm glad you're doing this, Sophia. Your father would have been so proud of you, White Eagle said as she fluffed her veil. A gift from Kate and Beth. Jonathan had bought her the gown, sending his good customer Mrs. Laura Dickens to Sacramento for it, without her knowledge. Because it was a perfect fit, she knew that Abby had been the one who gave them the measurements. Oh, Grandma, I wish Papa was here to walk me down the aisle. Don't worry. My brother is ready, as are your many cousins, she chuckled. People are going to be surprised to see this bride being escorted down the aisle by about 10 men. And I couldn't be happier. There was a knock at the door, and Abby stuck her head in. There's someone waiting to come in. May I let them in? As long as it isn't Jonathan, anyone else can come in. I want to see his face when he sees me walking down the aisle, and so he shouldn't see me just yet. No, it's not Jonathan. Abby stepped aside, and Sophia gave a small cry. Mama, you're here. I didn't hear the coach drive up. With all the loud drums and chanting, you can't hear anything, Abby said, shutting the door so it was just the three of them. White Eagle. Deborah held out her hands, and the two women hugged each other for a long while. Sophia then realized just how close these two had been. Then her mother turned to her. I prayed that we would get here in good time and not miss your wedding. You're so beautiful, Sophia, and thank you for asking me to come and celebrate this special day with you." Something her mother said struck her. Yes, Deborah seemed a little nervous. Mr. Kincaid, Pam, and Alice refused to let me come alone. "Ma?" Sophia started trembling. "They are here." "Yes, I feel that it's time for us to be reconciled, and what better day than this, when we are celebrating your wedding day." "Oh, Ma, you don't know how happy this makes me. Where are they now?" We were all so nervous as to how you would react, so I asked them to wait downstairs in the living room. "Quick, Mama, bring them up here. Now Papa can give me away." Abby overheard the conversation as she was coming to check if Sophia was ready and quickly went downstairs and then led the nervous-looking gentleman and 2 girls up the stairs. "Are you sure she will see us?" "Mr. Kincaid, I heard her with my own 2 ears. She knocked on the door and stuck her head in. More people to see you, Sophia. Your father and sisters." Sophia turned towards the door and stood waiting as her stepfather and sisters entered the bedroom. "Papa." "My child," George said in a soft voice, and she flew across the room and into his waiting arms. They held each other and wept, each saying how sorry they were for the years that had passed between them that were filled with so much fear and bitterness. "You'll make everyone think we're fighting if you don't stop wailing. All of you," Deborah said. The joy on her face couldn't be contained. She'd prayed for this day for so long. "Pam and Alice, come and greet your sister." Once again, there were more hugs all around, and when everyone was calm, Sophia turned to her stepfather. "Papa, I'd like for you to meet White Eagle. She is my father's mother, the one I came to find." White Eagle smiled at the man who'd raised her grandchild. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid." "For what?" He actually looked surprised. "For giving my loved ones a good home for all these years." "I wish I would have done more." George turned eyes filled with regret towards Sophia. "Oh, Papa, I'm so glad you're here. Will you do the honors of giving me away?" George made a choked sound and nodded. Sophia couldn't believe that the Lord had answered her prayers, and she was reconciled with her whole family. She wanted to ask about Nana Barbie, but time was running out. Besides, they would have plenty of time to talk later. Right now, Jonathan was waiting for her. The red-haired man standing outside the church caught everyone's eye as the colorfully decorated buggies rolled into the compound. Jonathan had asked his friends to provide an entourage to the church, and more than he'd asked for had been given. Kate, Beth, and Abby had outdone themselves in decorating the vehicles. But all eyes were fixed on the red-haired man. It was like looking at Jonathan in about 3 decades to come. There were 2 other red-haired men in their 20s with him, and a small woman with dark hair. Nobody said a word. When the bridal procession went into the church, the strangers followed and sat down in the back. Sophia glided down on her stepfather's arm, and right behind her were the Indian chief and her 5 male cousins. The church was packed because many people were curious about the bride's relatives. But they all admitted that she glowed and looked so beautiful. It was only after the beautiful and moving ceremony and everyone was standing outside the church that the red-haired man stepped forward. He cleared his throat nervously, and all the Rusher brothers turned to look at him. "My name is Christopher Lamb. Jenny Rusher, your mother, was my sister, many years younger than me." "What?" Jed stared at the man. Mama never once mentioned that she had a brother. "A stepbrother in actual fact. I was 20 when my mother died and my father married Jenny's mother, your grandmother. We didn't live together much because I was grown up and starting a family of my own." "So you're our uncle." Jonathan felt such deep relief within, and Sophia noticed that the tense look had gone from his face. True, he'd been most attentive as they exchanged their vows, but she'd seen him casting furtive glances towards the 3 red-headed men, and not my father? Christopher threw his head back and laughed out loud. "Oh my goodness, no. Jenny was my sister, and I can see why you would think that, seeing as all your brothers are dark-haired as were your parents. But you take after your grandfather." He dug into his jacket and pulled out a small colored photograph. "This was your grandfather. He died last year, and I started searching for you. How is it that we didn't know about him? Our mother never once mentioned him, and we always thought he died when she was young." Jedediah, who was nearest, grabbed the photo and then passed it to his brothers. "You mean all this time we had a living grandfather until last year?" "Yes. Unfortunately, our father and Jenny had a terrible row when she wouldn't marry the man he'd chosen for her and instead ran off with your father. They moved from Atlanta to North Carolina where they lived until their deaths. It was while your grandfather was on his deathbed that he asked me to find Jenny and beg for her forgiveness. He thought she was still alive and held on so he could see her and be reconciled. But by the time I got to where you used to live, I was informed that my sister and her husband had died a while back, and their 7 sons had moved to the West. My father died regretting that he hadn't reconciled sooner with his only daughter and charged me to find all of you. If it was the last thing I would ever do in my life." The 7 boys stare at their uncle. The information too much for them to bear. "Your grandfather was a very wealthy man, and he left you a sizable inheritance, which would have gone to your mother had she still been alive. But it's now all yours. I hired a private investigator to find you, and it took me nearly 6 months. It's wonderful to have arrived on this joyous day, but please pardon me." He held out a hand to the woman who'd been standing by. "This is my lovely wife, Annette, and our sons, Bruno and Abraham. They couldn't stay behind when I told them that I had found you and was coming to Woodland." One by one, the Rusher men, beginning with Jed, introduced themselves and their spouses for those who had them. They also introduced Sophia's family, all of them. "It's such a beautiful day, and we won't talk business. But perhaps we could all sit down on the morrow so I can tell you just what your grandfather left you." Chapter 13. The Vast Inheritance. Jonathan couldn't stop smiling. He really belonged to this family. All doubts and pain were gone, and he was beaming. "You look so happy, and so it should be, because it's your wedding day." The 7 brothers were standing together watching the celebrations going on. Their new Indian family members were indefatigable and were still leaping around. "We're so proud of you, Jonathan." Jed patted him on the back. "I have a confession to make to all of you," he said, rubbing his chin. "Please don't feel bad at what I have to say." "Go on," Joshua urged. "You always wondered why I kept aloof and isolated, but it's because I never felt like I truly belonged. Everyone always asked why I looked so much like all of you, but then also so different because of my hair. Then when I was 10, I overheard Grandma Beta telling a friend of hers that she didn't believe that I was Papa's son. At least not by birth." "What?" 3 voices burst out. "Yes, she said that Mama had stepped out on our father, and that's why I was such a different child from the rest of you. And I believed it for a long time and kept waiting for Papa to say something or even disown me. I was actually thinking of asking our parents about all that, but they died, and I didn't know if any of you knew that." "Jonathan." Jed stepped closer. When Ma and then Pa were dying, they asked me to especially watch you and make sure you never felt like an outsider. I think they knew what our grandmother was saying and wanted to protect us all. But we now know the truth. The grandfather we never met or even knew about is the reason you have different hair from ours. Now, are you at peace? Completely, no doubts left. The 7 boys met with their uncle at his hotel the next day after breakfast. It was like being part of a dream, and when he read their grandfather's will and everything he'd bequeathed to each of them, they stared at him with eyes as round as saucers. It was Joshua who found his voice first. Are you saying that our grandfather was so wealthy and left us all that? Christopher smiled at his nephews. That's right. I wish I had met all of you before. After Jenny left, Father made us all believe that my sister had died childless, and that was the reason I didn't try to find you before. He shook his head sadly. He only told me the truth on his deathbed and asked me to find Jenny. Apparently, he'd kept track of her whereabouts all this while but never once told anyone about it and only stopped when he got ill. That was why he didn't know that she had died. Our father was a very strict man, and his word was supposed to be law for everyone around him. I towed the line because I was weak, but Jenny, your mother and my sister, was headstrong, just like our father was. She refused to get married to the man our father chose because she'd fallen in love with your father, who was a simple man. He looked at them. She was the light of his life after her mother. Your grandmother died when she was only 2 years old. Was she happy? Jed nodded. Mama and Papa were very happy together and loved us so much. Losing them was so hard, and because it was too painful to remain at home, I decided to take advantage of the Homestead Act offer and moved everyone to California. It must have been really tough for you all. You were just a young boy on the threshold of adulthood when your parents died. How did you manage? As you say, Uncle, it was really hard, but God saw us through. And then I married Abby, and she helped me see so many things and also helped take care of my brothers. It's been a very tough nearly 16 years, but here we are. Never would I have imagined that Mama had a brother, and one who was still alive. She just never talked about her family at all. As you say, here we are, my dear nephew. Your aunt and cousins and I will be leaving tomorrow because we also have a large estate to run back in Atlanta. But I want you to promise that whenever you can and are ready, that you'll come and visit us. The 7 brothers all answered in the affirmative. Jonathan was the first one out because he wanted to see his bride and spend time with her. It seemed like every time he tried to get her alone, something or someone else came up. He hurried back home and found her seated on the porch at Abby's house with her grandmother and mother. You all look so solemn indeed. He looked at her. I hope nothing is wrong. Sophia shook her head and rose to her feet and moved into his arms. My mother was just telling me that my grandmother is dead. She died 2 weeks ago. Jonathan looked slightly confused, but White Eagle is right here. I meant my other grandmother, Nana Barbie. She died before she received my letter, so she never got to read what I'd written to her. What happened? Mama said she just started complaining of chest pains, but before they could call the doctor, she was gone. I'm very sorry for your loss. Shall we find your father and convey our condolences to him? There's more. What? Nana Barbie left me some money and she told him how much, and he smiled at her. That's good, isn't it? I never expected her to leave me anything. Not with the kind of relationship we had. This is so surprising, and I don't even know what to say. Shall we find her father? I don't think you'll find him soon because Chief Black Bear took him out to the hills. They're going to look at the reservation they abandoned 2 years ago, with hopes that they can return and settle there once again. That would be so wonderful, having your family so close by again. I don't want to lose them ever again. But finally, they could get away, and Jonathan carried his bride for most of the way, even though she protested that she was too heavy. I should have done this yesterday after the wedding, but there was too much going on. Thank you for being patient with me. She touched his cheek as he led her down on the steps. I'm your husband and want you to be happy. Now, shall we go into our house? He opened the door and she gasped in surprise. The room wasn't like she remembered it. Someone had taken the time to decorate it in her absence, and she turned to her husband. Who did all this for us? Everyone. You'll soon find out that this family is full of busybodies who like minding other people's business, but he said all this with a broad smile. His brothers and sisters, in-law, had outdone themselves. He'd taken a huge chunk out of his savings in the bank to get new furniture and drapes, entrusting the task to Abby and Jed, and they had outdone themselves. But I love them so much, Sophia said. It's wonderful that we have found our families and they are all getting along so well. They have to. It's our wedding season, and we expect everyone to be happy. He led her to the new couch. There's something that I want to share with you. Please don't think that I'm a foolish man, and he told her about the fears that he'd carried within him since he was 10. You've carried all that within for 15 years, Sophia asked her husband, taking his hand in hers. That's a very heavy secret to carry. But it's all gone now, and you have brought sunshine into my life. How so? Because of you, it's like the clouds have parted and I can see the sun. My inner storm is over, and this is a new day for me. The same goes for me, too. Sophia just couldn't contain her joy. When you and your brothers went to see your uncle, I also got time to speak with my sisters. It was so emotional, but we finally got everything out. What gives me so much joy is that Pam isn't going to marry the man my grandmother had chosen for her. At the time, she was only doing it to please our grandmother, but after I left, things started changing at home. How? Pam and Alice told me that my mother became withdrawn, and at one point, they thought she was going to walk out on our father. Oh, no. But then Nana Barbie sat everyone down and they had a very long talk. She apologized to my mother for having made me leave home. I think she knew she was dying and wanted to make things right. Maybe that's the reason she also left me $5,000. I always knew that she was a wealthy woman, but I didn't think she had that much money. So she left it all to you? No, mine is just a small fraction. Of course my father as her son got the bulk of it, but imagine she also left my mother $5,000. Pam and Alice got $10,000 each, no doubt for their dowry because she was old-fashioned like that. That was a very kind thing for her to do. I'm just happy that my sisters get to choose their husbands just like I did with mine. She snuggled close. It's hard to believe that we fell in love when I was unconscious. Very strange indeed, but we'll have a beautiful story to tell our grandchildren. I'm happy that I got a chance to live again, so I could fall in love with you, Jonathan. And you took me with all my flaws and all. You're just perfect for me. My dear husband, and if I had to do it all over again, I would. I love you so much, Jonathan Rusher. And I love you too, Sophia Tenderfoot Kincaid Rusher. He pulled her closer to him and covered her lips with his, sharing their very first of millions of kisses to come. The End. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.